Long before the black flags and cannon fire, before tales of buried treasure and rum-soaked ports, the world's oceans held a quieter, older rhythm, one shaped not by pirates, but by wind and wood, by salt air and sailcloth, and by the ancient, restless desire to move across water. Our story doesn't begin with a ship under attack, nor with a pirate captain shouting from the helm. It begins with something softer, the distant creak of a sail in the breeze, the first tentative steps of sailors venturing beyond sight of shore, and the slow realization that the sea could be not just a pathway, but a place to live and defy. To understand the pirates who would one day be feared and romanticized, we must start with the sailors who came before them, the traders, the fishermen, and the smugglers who blurred the lines between legality and survival. In the warm waters of the eastern Mediterranean around 1300 BCE, small wooden ships crisscrossed between Egypt, Crete, and the Levant. These vessels carried grain, olive oil, incense, and copper, but they also carried something else: vulnerability. Where there is trade, there is theft. And where there is theft, there eventually emerges the thief who knows the sea better than the law. Some of the earliest pirate-like groups were the so-called Sea Peoples, enigmatic confederations of raiders who appeared suddenly and violently in the records of ancient Egypt. Pharaohs carved anxious records of these intruders, who swept down in shallow draft boats, disappearing just as quickly as they came. While modern historians still debate who they were or where they came from, these marauders left behind a curious legacy, one of mobility, unpredictability, and the unsettling ability to disappear into the endless blue. As the centuries passed and empires rose along the coasts, Rome, Carthage, Byzantium, piracy adapted to the changing world. Roman merchants sailing from Hispania to Syria were often forced to hire armed guards or travel in fleets. Despite Rome's reputation for dominance on land, its early naval power was relatively weak. In the 3rd century BCE, pirates thrived in the Aegean, launching from island hideouts, taking not just cargo but people. Slavery, after all, was one of piracy's most lucrative industries, and Roman markets were hungry. One of the most quietly extraordinary stories from this era involves a young Roman named Gaius Julius Caesar, captured by Cilician pirates as a rising but not yet famous figure. He was held for ransom on a quiet island off the coast of modern Turkey. While there, Caesar reportedly mingled easily with his captors, even joking that they had set his ransom too low. When the sum was paid and he was released, he didn't forget. Gathering ships, he returned, captured the very men who had detained him, and in keeping with the justice of the day, had them executed. A moment of vengeance, yes, but also a glimpse into how blurred the lines could be between power and piracy. But most pirate stories weren't so grand or dramatic. For every Caesar, there were thousands of nameless sailors, ordinary men swept into lives of quiet lawlessness. When storms dashed their fishing boats or taxis emptied their nets, some turned to raiding not from ambition, but from necessity. The sea offered freedom, yes, but it also offered no guarantees. A pirate's life was often short, violent, and uncertain, and yet for many it remained preferable to the rigid hierarchies of life on land. By the time the first millennium came to a close, piracy had spread far beyond the Mediterranean. In the distant north, Norse raiders, the Vikings, began to strike terror into the coasts of England, Ireland, and Frankish Europe. Though often remembered today as warriors and settlers, they were also pirates in the truest sense, opportunistic seafarers striking at weak points along the coast, vanishing before any retaliation could be organized. Their sleek, shallow ships gave them an eerie advantage, able to navigate rivers and reach deep inland before returning to the sea. In the east, too, pirate activity was evolving. Along the Chinese coastline, especially during periods of dynastic transition. Seaborne raiders emerged who defied imperial control. Some were small-time smugglers and thieves. Others, like the later Wokou pirates of the 14th and 16th centuries, formed powerful networks that spanned Japan, China, and even parts of Southeast Asia, defying borders, allegiances, and classification. They were not always outsiders. Many were former soldiers, disgraced officials, or coastal villagers with few other options. And so, as the medieval world began to stretch toward the Age of Discovery, the idea of piracy was no longer bound to a single place. It became a pattern, a possibility, and a presence, appearing wherever trade flourished and wherever order struggled to contain ambition. The oceans, vast and ungoverned, had become a stage, and soon the curtain would rise on the so-called Golden Age. But before we meet the infamous names carved into maritime lore, before Blackbeard, Bonny, or Captain Kidd, there is still more quiet, forgotten history beneath the surface. The world that gave rise to the pirates we think we know was already teeming with stories of its own. Soft-footed traders in moonlit coves, whispered alliances in candlelit taverns, and secret maps passed hand to hand beneath the hush of salt and stars. And so, our journey begins, not with gunpowder, but with wind, not with war cries, but with wood and sail. The story of piracy, after all, was always a little softer than we remember, and far more human.
As the map of the world expanded in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, so too did the shadowy lanes through which seafarers moved unnoticed. The great maritime empires of Spain and Portugal had begun carving their domains across the Americas and Asia, planting flags on beaches, claiming rivers, and filling their hulls with silver, spices, and stories. But where power concentrates, resistance gathers, and where galleons sail fat with gold, there are always those who drift nearby, watching the horizon with quiet, patient eyes. In the background of imperial conquest, a different kind of sailor emerged, not sanctioned by crowns or guided by laws, but equally skilled in navigation, just as fluent in wind and tide. These were the early modern pirates, corsairs and privateers, and their lives unfolded in the in-between places, coves hidden from view, ports just out of reach of colonial law, and taverns where coin flowed and tongues wagged freely. One of the first to truly shape this world of unofficial seafaring was the privateer, a legal pirate in essence. During times of war, European crowns issued letters of marque to captains willing to attack enemy ships on their behalf. These documents turned criminals into sanctioned warriors, but the distinction was always thin. Peace might come suddenly, rendering yesterday's privateer today's outlaw, and many simply ignored the paperwork altogether, preying on friend and foe alike, tucked behind a convenient justification or well-forged writ. Nowhere did this grey world of semi-sanctioned piracy thrive more than in the Caribbean, a region of shifting control, endless coastlines, and rich colonial wealth. As Spanish treasure fleets carried silver from Peru to Seville, English, Dutch, and French sailors grew restless. Unable to match Spanish dominance directly, they found power in disruption. Pirates became their shadow navy, irregular, unofficial, but devastatingly effective. And so emerged the infamous pirate havens, places more whispered than mapped. One of the earliest and most notorious was Tortuga, a small island just off the coast of Hispaniola. French privateers established it in the 1630s as a base for raids against Spanish holdings, and it quickly grew into a haven for the desperate and the daring. The port buzzed with energy. Sailors, escaped slaves, traders and rogues mingled freely. There was no singular authority,
only a shifting, fragile balance of needs and alliances. Life here was unpredictable, but for many it offered more opportunity than the rigid hierarchies of colonial society. Further south, the port of Port Royal in Jamaica grew into something even more complex. Once a Spanish settlement, it was seized by the English in 1655 and rapidly developed into a vital harbor. But its strategic importance also made it a magnet for pirates and privateers, especially during England's many maritime conflicts. By the late 1600s, Port Royal had become infamous, a place where, as one bishop famously lamented, the wickedest city in Christendom flourished. Yet behind the rumors of excess and debauchery lay a deeper truth. Port Royal was not merely a den of sin, but a critical gear in the economic engine of empire. Pirates brought in stolen Spanish silver, sold captured goods, and spent lavishly, fueling a colonial economy that often relied, quietly, on illegality to survive. For the sailors who passed through these ports, the lines between pirate, trader, and settler were often blurred. One day a man might raid a Spanish frigate under the justification of wartime privateering. The next he might sell its contents to a colonial governor who looked the other way. In return he might receive fresh supplies, minor repairs, or just enough coin to outfit another crew. Amid this shadow world, certain figures began to rise, names that carried weight among the waves. One such man was Henry Morgan, a Welsh privateer, who became both feared and celebrated in the 17th century. Morgan led daring raids against Spanish cities, including the infamous sacking of Panama in 1671, which was so violent that it drew international outrage. And yet Morgan returned to Jamaica a hero. Far from being punished, he was knighted by the English crown and made lieutenant governor of Jamaica. His transformation from pirate to politician was not an exception. It was a reflection of the era's fluid morality, where allegiance shifted with the tide. But not every pirate sought fame. Many were nameless sailors who fled indentured servitude or economic despair in Europe, seeking something more free, if not always more safe, in the vastness of the ocean. For them, the pirate havens offered a kind of rough, transient democracy. Crews often voted on leadership, shared plunder by agreement, and operated according to their own codes of conduct. It was not a utopia by any stretch. Disputes were common, discipline could be brutal, and survival was always uncertain. But compared to the life aboard merchant or naval ships, where lashings and hierarchies were rigid, piracy offered something rare: autonomy. As the 17th century drew on, these hidden communities began to network. Captains passed news between ports, shared information about Spanish treasure routes, and traded in more than just silver. They exchanged ideas, rumors, and even technology. Pirate ships, out of necessity, were often among the most adaptable at sea, constantly refitted, stripped down and optimized for speed and evasion. They favored shallow draft sloops and schooners that could slip through reefs and disappear into mangrove shallows, while heavier naval ships lumbered behind.
Beneath the crimson glow of a Caribbean dawn, with waves brushing softly against the hull of a sloop anchored in some forgotten cove, a story quietly unfolds, one not of swashbuckling heroism or buried gold, but of real people navigating a fragile existence between freedom and danger. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the so-called Golden Age of Piracy emerged, not suddenly but gradually, like a tide creeping up the shore. And with it came a new generation of pirates, whose names would echo through time. Some became infamous, others were almost lost. All of them lived in a world more uncertain than it seemed from afar. Among these figures was Edward Teach, better known to history as Blackbeard. The image of a fearsome captain with slow-burning fuses in his beard has become nearly mythic, a creature of fire and fury looming through smoke. But the man behind the image was something more precise, a strategist of fear. Blackbeard understood the power of perception. He captained the Queen Anne's Revenge, a former French slave ship converted into a floating fortress. With 40 guns and a loyal crew, he projected invincibility, yet records suggest that he often avoided unnecessary violence. More than brute force, he relied on intimidation, winning battles before they began, simply by appearing at the horizon like a spectre. His blockade of Charleston in 1718 was a masterstroke of pirate theatre. He held the city hostage for a week, not with cannons but with the threat of them, demanding medicine rather than treasure. And once his needs were met, he sailed away, leaving the port physically unharmed but shaken. It was a move that spoke volumes about pirate motivations in this era. Survival, health, supplies, treasure was rare. Livelihood was everything. Another figure, perhaps more elusive, was Bonny, whose story flickers through history like candlelight in a storm. Born in Ireland and raised in the American colonies, Anne was said to have left behind a conventional life in pursuit of something wilder. She joined the crew of Calico Jack, a pirate known more for style than substance, and sailed alongside another formidable woman, Mary Red. Together, the two disguised themselves as men to earn respect among the crew, only revealing their identities in moments of trust or fury. Their presence aboard a pirate ship was exceptional, not because women never sailed, but because they rarely made it into the official narratives. Anne and Mary weren't outliers in their courage or capability. They were simply among the few remembered. Their brief career ended in 1720, when their ship was captured by a British privateer near Jamaica. As legend goes, most of the male crew surrendered quickly, but Anne and Mary fought to the end, reportedly cursing their crewmates for cowardice. Imprisoned and sentenced to death, both women claimed pregnancy, a plea known as pleading the belly, which granted temporary reprieve. Mary would die in prison. Anne's fate remains uncertain, vanishing from the records after her stay in jail. Some believe she was released and returned to a quieter life under a new name. Whatever the truth, her legend became a symbol, not of rebellion for its own sake, but of the hunger for autonomy in a world with few options for women who refused to obey. Then there was Bartholomew Roberts, known to sailors as Black Bart. Dressed in fine clothes and known for his almost puritanical discipline, Roberts was one of the most successful pirates in terms of prizes taken, over 400 ships by some counts. Unlike many of his peers, he wasn't motivated by revelry or chaos. He was organized, efficient, and utterly committed to the life he chose. Under his leadership, crews followed a strict pirate code which forbade gambling, drinking during duty, and even bringing women aboard. His ships were clean, his crews loyal, but success brought enemies, and in 1722, Roberts was killed in a naval engagement off the coast of West Africa. He was buried at sea, as most pirates were, swallowed by the very waters that had sustained him. While these names shine brightly in the annals of piracy, most of those who lived this life remain nameless. They were runaway slaves from the sugar fields of Barbados, indentured servants from England who had jumped ship, sailors who had lost everything in a storm and found in piracy their only path forward. For many, it was not about treasure, it was about time. Pirate crews divided their loot equally, voted on leadership and lived, however briefly, in something closer to equality than the societies they left behind. It was a fragile kind of freedom, and it came at a price. The ocean, after all, is both liberator
and executioner. Ships were often poorly supplied. Disease spread quickly. Navies and bounty hunters lurked beyond every headland. The average pirate career lasted less than 2 years. Most died at sea. Others were captured and publicly hanged, their bodies displayed in iron cages, gibbeted as a warning to others. Yet even these grim displays could not extinguish the draw of the life itself, a life lived just beyond the reach of rules and rulers. This was the world behind the legends, not a fantasy, but a floating community bound together by choice, necessity, and the ever-changing moods of the sea. The names we remember are only the tip of the mast. Beneath them are thousands of voices lost to time, but not forgotten by the waves.
In the calm between storms, when the sails hung loose and the ocean breathed a gentle rhythm beneath the hull, pirate crews returned to a truth rarely spoken of in stories, that freedom, even at sea, required structure. Behind the chaos of raids and the thrill of open water lay a delicate fabric of agreements, expectations, and deeply personal codes of conduct. For a pirate ship to function, to remain afloat, armed and fed, it needed more than bravery. It needed order, however rough or flexible. And in this, pirates crafted something quietly remarkable. They called them articles, a kind of shipboard constitution, written not in the spirit of authority, but of mutual survival. These weren't imposed from above, but voted on by the crew, often before a voyage began. Each man, regardless of background, had a say. The articles spelled out not just shares of plunder, but rules of engagement, punishments for theft, and systems for resolving disputes. They might dictate quiet hours, assign responsibilities, or clarify procedures if the captain was incapacitated. In this floating world where death was always near, clarity was a kind of comfort. A captain held power, yes, but his role was often more democratic than despotic. He was chosen by the crew, and if his leadership failed, if he was reckless, cruel, or cowardly, he could be removed by vote. In battle, he commanded. In everyday life, he was one among many. The quartermaster was equally important, often acting as a counterbalance to the captain's authority. He managed supplies, divided loot, and enforced the articles, a kind of internal governor, trusted to keep fairness afloat. Among the most well-known of these codes was that of Bartholomew Roberts, the disciplined pirate captain we met earlier. His articles forbade gambling aboard ship, demanded early extinguishing of candles at night, and laid out strict rules for cleanliness and decorum. Fines were imposed for theft. Disputes were settled ashore, sometimes with sword or pistol informal duels. Injuries were compensated with generous shares. A sailor who lost an arm or leg might receive a lump sum of gold, enough to start a new life on land. There was, beneath the violent trade, a system of care. This mutual protection extended into quieter aspects of pirate life too. Ships functioned as communities, with rhythms of work and rest, song and silence. There were chores to be done, repairs to make, sails to stitch, and decks to scrub. Meals were shared, often meager: salted meat, hard tack, beans, and whatever could be fished or stolen. Water was precious, rum a common currency. Music was frequent, often improvised. Sailors sang not only to pass the time, but to soothe the mind, to keep cadence while hauling rope, or to fill the vast echoing quiet of the sea at night. Superstition played a gentle guiding role in the lives of many pirates. A quiet respect for fate lingered in their routines. Whistling aboard ship was discouraged, said to summon wind or worse, a storm. Changing a ship's name was considered dangerously unlucky, as was sailing on a Friday. Tattoos, charms, and amulets were common. A pierced ear was believed to improve eyesight.
A gold earring might pay for a sailor's funeral. Some even carried bits of coral or teeth strung on thread, tokens from home or talismans against drowning. Pirate ships were also, at times, places of unlikely refuge. In a world bound by empire, race, and class, the pirate vessel was one of the few spaces where those divisions, though not erased, were softened. People of African descent, often escaped slaves or freedmen, served as valued crew members, not just laborers but officers, gunners, even captains in rare cases. The line between enslaved and free was on pirate ships, drawn differently than on land. What mattered most was skill, trust, and loyalty. The infamous pirate Black Caesar, for example, was said to have escaped from bondage and risen through the ranks of several crews, eventually becoming a trusted officer under Blackbeard. His story, like so many others, slips in and out of myth, but it reflects a broader truth that piracy, while not a pure egalitarian ideal, often created space for those excluded elsewhere. Women, too, found passage aboard ships, sometimes in disguise, sometimes openly, not merely as passengers or companions, but as active participants in the life of the sea. Though the pirate world could be brutal, it was also deeply human. Injuries were cared for, stories were told and retold, and moments of joy punctuated the hardship. Sailors celebrated when treasure was found, but also when storms passed, or when a crewmate recovered from illness. A successful escape from pursuit might spark days of laughter. A clear night sky could draw men up from their hammocks to gaze in silence, each lost in private thought. When pirates returned to their hidden ports, they often did so not just to spend their spoils, but to reconnect with land-bound rhythms. Some settled, started families, or disappeared into coastal towns under assumed names. Others squandered their wealth in a few feverish weeks and returned to sea, drawn back by the freedom and danger of the life they knew best. There was a deep, quiet melancholy to these cycles, a knowledge that this kind of existence could not last forever, and perhaps was never meant to. On moonlit shores, and in the silent depths of attics across the world, the image persists, an old weathered map, its edges singed and stained with salt, marked by cryptic symbols and a single bold X. Beneath that spot, one imagines, lies a chest, heavy with gold doubloons, glittering jewels, and relics from a forgotten age. It is one of the most enduring images in all of pirate lore. And yet, in the vast annals of actual pirate history, such buried treasure was not only rare, it was nearly non-existent. The idea of pirates burying their loot comes largely from literature, not life. Stories like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in the late 19th century, helped romanticize the pirate figure and cement the myth of secret hoards hidden beneath palm trees. But real pirates lived with a much more immediate reality. Gold was heavy, risky to transport, and even more dangerous to leave unattended. Most preferred to spend their earnings quickly, often in bursts of brief, intense celebration. Others reinvested their shares in future voyages or spread their wealth through networks of local merchants and trusted tavern keepers. To bury treasure was to risk never seeing it again. This isn't to say pirates didn't deal in riches. They absolutely did. But treasure in the early modern world came in many forms, not all of them gleaming. A valuable haul might include barrels of flour, crates of tobacco, bolts of silk, or casks of sugar and rum. These goods could be sold in secretive markets or used directly to supply pirate crews. The economic web of piracy extended far beyond isolated treasure chests. It was, in many ways, a parallel economy, one that fed into the legitimate world in quiet, persistent ways. Of course, there were exceptions. Some pirates, especially those who struck Spanish treasure galleons returning from the Americas, did indeed seize silver and gold. The Spanish Empire shipped vast quantities of silver mined from Potosí, high in the mountains of modern-day Bolivia, and refined in the great silver towns of Mexico. These shipments traveled overland to Caribbean ports and were loaded onto large, well-armed ships bound for Europe. Pirates who managed to intercept these convoys or simply attacked isolated merchant vessels carrying pieces of the load occasionally made sudden, immense fortunes. But these prizes were perilous. Silver was bulky and hard to hide. Gold attracted attention, and jewels, unless immediately liquidated, were of little use to men in need of gunpowder, food, or new sails. The most successful pirates weren't necessarily those who sought out treasure chests, but those who knew how to turn captured goods into functional value, resupplying their ships, strengthening alliances, or disappearing into port cities under new names. In fact, one of the most fascinating aspects of pirate economics was the reliance on a vast, unofficial network of black market traders and sympathetic merchants. These figures, often colonial settlers or urban shopkeepers, played a vital role in converting stolen cargo into usable currency. They provided no-questions-asked exchanges, offered discreet repairs, and in many cases warned pirates of impending naval patrols. Some towns quietly thrived on this business, existing in a kind of unspoken partnership with piracy itself. Within this web of exchange, one item often took on an outsized importance: rum. Distilled from sugarcane molasses in the Caribbean, rum was cheap to make, easy to transport, and in constant demand. Pirates drank it, traded it, and stole it in massive quantities. It became not just a vice, but a kind of currency, passed from ship to ship, from port to port, binding together a far-flung community of sailors, smugglers, and opportunists. In many ways, rum was the true treasure of the Golden Age, accessible, immediate, and deeply embedded in the rhythm of pirate life. Still, the allure of traditional treasure persisted, even among pirates themselves. Stories circulated of lost ships and forgotten hoards, often growing with each telling. One such tale involves the infamous Captain Kidd, a Scottish privateer whose reputation veered wildly between honored servant of the crown and outright criminal. In 1699, Kidd was captured and eventually executed in London, hanged twice. In fact, when the rope snapped during the first attempt. But before his death, rumors swirled that he had hidden a vast treasure somewhere along the American coast. Searches were launched, and small caches were indeed found on Gardiner's Island off New York, but the legend of a great buried hoard endured far beyond the reality. These kinds of tales served a purpose. They fed the imaginations of land dwellers, gave shape to the invisible wealth that pirates were believed to command, and perhaps most importantly, offered a tantalizing sense of unfinished business. The buried treasure became a symbol, not just of wealth, but of freedom deferred. It suggested that the pirate's life, though cut short or faded into obscurity, might still echo through time, leaving behind not just memories but material legacy waiting to be uncovered. And so the stories multiplied of islands shaped like skulls, of lone survivors returning decades later to reclaim what was hidden, of maps inked in cryptic symbols and folded into family Bibles. Few, if any, of these stories were ever proven true, but they endured because they answered a deeper question, not just where the treasure went, but why people chose this life at all.
By the early 18th century, the open sea no longer offered the same refuge it once had. The hidden ports, the shadow economies, the quiet agreements between pirates and colonial officials, these had all begun to fray. The winds were changing. Trade routes were more established. Naval patrols grew stronger. And most crucially, the European powers that had once turned a blind eye to piracy, or even nurtured it in times of war, were now unified in a new ambition: order. In this new world, piracy had become inconvenient, and so the long hunt began. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Colonial governors, once friendly or indifferent to pirate activity, began to receive direct pressure from London, Paris, and Madrid. The great powers of Europe, weary of the unpredictable violence that piracy brought to their growing merchant fleets, began to see pirates not as useful tools, but as dangerous liabilities. Their economies were maturing. Their overseas colonies were becoming more deeply entwined with mainland commerce, and the very disorder that had allowed piracy to flourish was being replaced by tighter control. The turning point came in the 1710s and 1720s, when the British government issued a series of proclamations offering royal pardons to pirates who surrendered voluntarily. These pardons were both a promise and a threat. For those who gave themselves up, there was a chance at peace, a future on land. But for those who refused or returned to piracy after accepting, the punishment would be swift and final. One of the most notable enforcers of this policy was Wooders Rogers, a former privateer appointed governor of the Bahamas in 1718. Nassau, the capital of the Bahamas, had long been a pirate haven, lawless, strategic, and deeply entangled in the Atlantic underworld. Rogers arrived not as a diplomat, but as a reformer. He brought with him soldiers, ships, and clear orders: shut it down. The effect was immediate. Many pirates fled. Some surrendered, accepting the king's pardon and attempting, however uneasily, to return to civilian life. Others resisted. Among them was Charles Vane, a bold and aggressive pirate who rejected the pardon and continued raiding, refusing to bend to the new order. His fate was sealed. Captured after a shipwreck, Vane was brought to Jamaica, tried, and hanged in 1721. His body was displayed in chains, a common practice meant to dissuade others, though it often only added to the legend. Not all went so defiantly. The famed Blackbeard, who had also operated out of the Carolinas and the Bahamas, flirted with legitimacy in his final years. He accepted a pardon from the governor of North Carolina and even attempted to settle into a quieter life. But suspicion followed him. When rumors arose that he had returned to piracy, a British naval expedition led by Lieutenant Robert Maynard was dispatched to hunt him down. The resulting battle off Ocracoke Island in 1718 was brutal and brief. Blackbeard was killed, his body riddled with bullets and sword wounds. His head was severed and displayed from Maynard's ship as proof. The message was clear: the era of pirate kings was ending. As the 1720s drew on, the pressure continued to mount. Naval patrols grew more aggressive. Laws were tightened. Courts were established in colonial ports, specifically to try pirates, often with minimal ceremony. The executions became routine, somber affairs held in harbors where crowds gathered to watch bodies swing over the water. The gallows became a fixture of port cities, their presence a reminder that the ocean, once a place of escape, now bore the weight of consequence. And yet, even in this time of decline, piracy did not vanish. It adapted. The Atlantic world had been transformed by the movements of people, goods, and power, and piracy continued to flicker along its edges. Some pirates simply changed names and slipped into the growing network of smugglers, traders, and privateers.
Others moved their operations farther afield, toward the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea and the East Indies, where European navies held less sway. One of the most remarkable figures from this wider world was Qing Shi, a former prostitute who rose to command a vast pirate confederation off the coast of China in the early 19th century. Decades after the Golden Age of the Atlantic had ended, at the height of her power, she led a fleet of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors. She defeated both Chinese and European naval forces and eventually negotiated a peaceful retirement, keeping her wealth and authority intact. Her story serves as a quiet reminder that piracy was never confined to one region, nor did it follow a single pattern. It emerged wherever there was imbalance between wealth and poverty, law and opportunity, empire and survival. But for the Atlantic pirates, the Blackbeards, the Bonnies, the Rackhams and Roberts, the golden moment had passed. By the mid-1720s, the era was largely over. Pirate havens were dismantled, their taverns emptied, their docks repurposed. Ships that once flew the black flag were broken up or absorbed into colonial fleets. And the men and women who had lived on the edge of the known world, sailing by choice, by chance, or by necessity, faded quietly into history. Still, they left their mark. The pirate stories that linger today, filled with adventure, danger, and freedom, were born not from the loudest battles, but from the deep resonance of that short, stormy age. An age when, for a time, the rules were rewritten by those bold enough to sail beyond them.
Long after the last gallows were emptied and the black flags lowered, something curious began to happen. The world that had so rigorously stamped out piracy began to speak of it again, but now in softer tones, with a hint of nostalgia, even admiration. The men and women once feared as lawless marauders were slowly recast in the collective imagination as symbols of freedom, rebellion, and adventure. Their names, once whispered in fear by merchants and governors, began to echo through books, songs, and stories told by firelight. In being erased, pirates became legends. Part of this transformation came from the ocean itself, its vastness, its mystery. The sea forgets nothing, yet reveals little. It preserves the idea of disappearance, of ships that sailed off and were never seen again, of islands glimpsed through mist, of messages in bottles never answered. In this world of loose ends, pirates were perfectly at home. They were people who had stepped outside the known paths of society, who had lived by their own codes, and who, whether by sword, storm, or surrender, vanished in ways that invited imagination, and imagination responded. In the 18th and 19th centuries, long after piracy's golden chapter had ended, writers, artists, and historians began to revisit the lives of these outlaws. Some sought to preserve the truth. Others crafted something entirely new. The tone shifted from condemnation to curiosity, and then to romance. Books like Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, helped shape the popular image of the pirate. Though its authorship is debated, some have even suggested it may have been a pen name for Daniel Defoe. Its impact was profound. Johnson's accounts blended truth with embellishment, crafting larger-than-life portraits of pirates like Blackbeard, Mary Read, and Calico Jack. These stories were devoured by readers in England and beyond, turning real figures into near-mythical characters. As the centuries wore on, pirate lore seeped into popular culture in ever deeper ways. Seafaring songs and folk ballads kept the memory alive among coastal communities. Children played at being pirates in seaside villages. By the time the Victorian era arrived, with its love of the romantic and the exotic, piracy had fully entered the realm of entertainment. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, cemented many of the clichés we now associate with pirates: talking parrots, buried chests, treasure maps marked with an X, and the unforgettable image of a wooden-legged sailor with a flask of rum and a gleam in his eye. Though it was fiction, it drew heavily from the real figures of the past, and in doing so, blurred the lines between history and fantasy for generations to come. Yet even as piracy became a kind of performance in Western literature, its echoes remained tangible in other ways. Nautical language, shaped in part by pirate crews, entered everyday speech. Terms like "to strike your colors, to surrender," "under the weather," and "three sheets to the wind" trace their roots to life at sea. Even the phrase "on the account," once pirate slang for joining a crew in search of profit, remains faintly visible in the concept of taking stock or being called to account. In the Americas, especially along the eastern seaboard and the Caribbean, pirate legends became part of local folklore. Towns like Charleston, Salem, St. Augustine, and Port Royal all carried stories of hidden tunnels, lost gold, or ghost ships that appeared on moonless nights. Some of these tales were rooted in fact, remnants of real raids or shipwrecks, while others were purely imagined, but all served the same quiet function: to keep the past alive, not as dusty record, but as living memory. Meanwhile, artifacts of pirate life occasionally surfaced: a rusted cutlass dredged from a harbor, a coin with a Spanish cross found buried near a dune, or the skeleton of a ship revealed by a low tide. These finds did not always confirm legends, but they did something more lasting. They made the stories feel just real enough, just plausible enough to wonder, to search, to dream, and piracy never truly disappeared. Though the great era of the Atlantic pirates had ended, seaborne raiding adapted to new times and technologies. Smuggling flourished in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially during periods of trade restriction and prohibition. Privateers re-emerged during wars, sailing once again under letters of marque, and in more recent times, piracy took on modern forms: speedboats replacing schooners, satellite phones replacing hand-drawn maps. From the coast of Somalia to the Strait of Malacca, piracy remains a real and pressing challenge in parts of the modern world, not with the flourish of feathered hats, but with AK-47s and encrypted bank accounts. Still, what endures most strongly in the public imagination is the older kind, the romantic pirate, the rebel of the seas. He or she lives not on battlefields or in courtrooms, but in the spaces between maps, in the unclaimed islands, the fogged horizons, and the secret coves of the human mind. In this sense, the legacy of pirates is not just historical, but emotional. It taps into a longing for freedom, for escape, for a life unbound by rules and routines. Though their flags flew high and their raids were bold, pirates did not survive on swagger alone. Beneath the noise and the legends, their world was tethered to something more intricate: a deep knowledge of wind, water, and the human networks that stitched one distant shore to another. They were, above all else, navigators, not only of the ocean, but of empire, conflict, and opportunity. In a world shaped by ever-shifting alliances and vast, uncharted spaces, their ability to move quietly and cleverly was their greatest weapon. To begin, there was the sea itself, a living, shifting map with its own rules and rhythms. Pirates of the Atlantic and Caribbean understood the winds and currents not just generally, but intimately. They studied the trade winds, those dependable east-to-west breezes that had powered European ships toward the Americas for centuries. They watched the westerlies which could return them eastward when the time was right, and they knew the hidden dangers that came with these patterns: The lull of the doldrums near the equator, the spiraling fury of late summer hurricanes, and the narrow channels where a misjudged tide could send a ship crashing into coral. In an era before accurate marine chronometers, and before most sailors could calculate longitude with any precision, these men relied on a blend of inherited knowledge, shared stories, and experience. Pirate captains carried old charts, many captured from merchant ships, but just as often they used mental maps passed down by word of mouth. "There's a reef there," someone might whisper over a mug of rum. "A good hiding spot 2 leagues south of the inlet. Deep water but no patrols." This informal cartography was a kind of collective intelligence, a pirate's version of navigation, forged not in textbooks but in conversation. The routes they followed were not always marked, but they were known. They led to coves where fresh water could be gathered, to towns with sympathetic merchants, to isolated islets where a damaged ship might be careened, hauled ashore, repaired, and sent back to sea. These hidden places formed a quiet geography of piracy. They were not grand cities or fortified ports, but small, often overlooked corners of the map. Providence Island, Ilavash, Roatan, the Tobago Cays. Some were little more than outcrops with fresh water. Others supported small, shifting populations of former sailors, escaped slaves, or indigenous groups who had learned to coexist with the pirate crews. These places were both lifeline and sanctuary, homes to a different rhythm of life, where news passed quickly and silently. Communication between pirate crews was similarly informal, yet surprisingly efficient. Ships might exchange signals using flags, gunfire, or lanterns. News of a naval patrol, a rich convoy, or a captured captain could spread across hundreds of miles in a matter of days. Letters were occasionally exchanged, especially between pirate allies. Messages might be tucked into barrels, smuggled in bundles of tobacco, or carried by trusted intermediaries. The flow of information was as important as wind or sail, and just as carefully tended. A key role in this network was played by those who stayed on land but worked closely with pirates, the go-betweens. These included port tavern keepers, small-scale merchants, shipwrights, and even corrupt officials. They accepted stolen goods, warned of incoming threats, or quietly arranged repairs. Many did not think of themselves as criminals. They were simply operating in the wide gray area between commerce and illegality, a space where survival often required flexibility more than lawfulness. Some of the most essential services came from people who never fired a shot or stepped aboard a pirate ship. Sailmakers, for example, were vital. A pirate crew could be marooned without new canvas. Blacksmiths crafted hooks, hinges, and the delicate parts of flintlocks and cannons. Physicians, rare but deeply valued, were sometimes kidnapped from captured ships and convinced through coin or threat to join a crew. A good surgeon could mean the difference between life and death, after battle or illness, and illness was always near. Pirates, like all sailors of the age, faced a brutal catalogue of health risks: scurvy, born from vitamin deficiency; malaria, contracted in the humid, mosquito-laden tropics; dysentery, from poor water and food. Even small injuries could fester into fatal infections. Cleanliness aboard ship was therefore prized more than legend suggests. Crews were often meticulous about maintaining their hammocks, washing their clothes, and keeping rats at bay. The sea might be wild, but the ship, their floating home, needed to be kept as safe and functional as possible. Amid these efforts, the weather remained an ever-present and unpredictable force. Pirates respected the sky with a quiet reverence. They read clouds, watched bird patterns, listened to the tone of the wind. A slight shift in humidity or pressure
might mean a storm was hours away. The timing of a raid could hinge on such observations. A heavy fog could be an ally or a death sentence, depending on which ship emerged first. All of this, the wind, the sea, the hidden places and silent messages, created a web of movement that held pirate society together. Their world was not built on brute force alone, but on understanding. They navigated both water and politics. They survived by slipping between the cracks of empire, always just ahead of the law, always just outside the reach of the known.
Far from the roaring cannons and storm-lashed decks so often imagined in tales of piracy, there existed a softer, more human dimension, one rarely spoken of in bold terms, yet ever present beneath the surface. A pirate's life, for all its outward defiance, was filled with absence. It was built on distance from land, from family, from law, and often from the self one had once been. Beneath the daring raids and coded flags, many sailors carried a quiet ache for stability, for belonging, for something like home. This longing was not always visible. Among pirate crews, camaraderie ran deep, formed through shared hardship and the ever-present risk of death. These were men, and sometimes women, who had seen each other through storms, through wounds, through starvation and fear. Bonds formed quickly in such conditions, and for many these friendships became the closest thing to family. When a crewmate was lost, whether by battle, illness or accident, their absence left a mark. Some ships held small, improvised rituals for the dead. A toast poured into the sea, a moment of silence at dusk, a line added to a captain's log. At night, when the sails were tied and the stars filled the sky in eerie silence, sailors often lay in their hammocks and remembered a childhood street, a mother's voice, the smell of a market in some city long behind them. Many pirates had not been born into piracy. They had come to it after loss, betrayal, poverty, or punishment. They carried wounds that were not always visible, debts unpaid, families abandoned, names they no longer used. And while some drank to forget, others held on to memories like small, worn stones, smooth from handling, kept tucked away inside the mind. Letters were rare, but not unknown. A few pirates wrote to family members back in England, France, or the colonies. Others dictated their final words to fellow crewmen, asking that, should the ship ever return to port, someone might deliver a message home. These gestures, so quiet, so easily lost in the noise of history, remind us that the pirate was never just a symbol of freedom. He was a person, adrift in a world that often offered no other place to stand. Loyalty among pirate crews was also complex. Betrayal was always a risk. A man might inform on his shipmates for a pardon or a reward. But just as often, pirates showed remarkable loyalty, not to flag or nation, but to each other. Crews sometimes went to great lengths to rescue a captured member or avenge a fallen friend. Decisions were made communally. Votes were held not just for leadership, but for punishment, for division of spoils, even for changes in course. In this shared governance, a strange kind of intimacy took root. Each sailor depended on the others not only for survival, but for dignity. Still, loyalty had its limits. Harsh conditions, conflicting goals, and human frailty could fracture even the closest bonds. Some captains, once beloved, grew paranoid or cruel. Some crewmen, once steady, drank too deeply or defied orders. Mutiny, while not common, was always a possibility. And so, pirates navigated not only the dangers of the sea, but the fragile landscape of human trust. A task as difficult, perhaps, as steering through reefs in a storm. Music and storytelling helped bridge the emotional distance. Sea shanties, often improvised,
served both as rhythm for work and as balm for the soul. Their melodies rose and fell like waves, carrying jokes, grievances, hopes, and warnings. A common song might speak of a far-off lover, a lost ship, or a promise to return that would likely never be kept. These songs echoed across the deck, into the sails, into the night. Quiet proof that for all their hardness, these men had not let go of tenderness entirely. Even in their downtime, when docked at a port or anchored in a quiet bay, pirates often revealed more nuanced emotions than the legends allow. Some formed relationships in coastal towns, sometimes fleeting, sometimes lasting. There are records of pirates settling briefly, marrying, or adopting local customs. These unions were rarely recognized by law, but they were real, lived within the soft space between impermanence and affection. And when these bonds were broken by departure, the sadness was often mutual. Then there was the fear, unspoken, but felt. Pirates lived on borrowed time. Most knew they would not grow old aboard a ship. Illness, injury, execution, or shipwreck would claim them long before age ever could. This knowledge lent urgency to everything, to the laughter, the drinking, the reckless decisions. But it also left space for reflection. Some pirates, especially in their final days, confessed regrets. A few even wrote down their memories in journals or dictated them to clergy or jailers. These fragments give us brief, flickering glimpses into the inner life of people who knew the tide would soon take them. One such example comes from William Fly, a pirate who was hanged in Boston in 1726. In the days before his execution, he scolded the shipowners and captains who had abused sailors, claiming that poor treatment was what drove many to piracy. He asked that his body be buried respectfully, with weights to keep it beneath the water so it would not wash ashore and be desecrated. His words, quiet and firm, remind us that piracy was often a response, not merely to greed, but to injustice, to desperation, to the ache for dignity.
Though the Caribbean and Atlantic are often seen as piracy's beating heart, the world's oceans have always whispered of outlaws. Long before and long after the so-called Golden Age, piracy took root in other waters, in different forms, under different names, shaped by the rhythms of local culture and the geography of power. Across the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the sprawling Pacific, a quieter, often overlooked history of piracy unfolded, one just as rich, just as human, and just as essential to the story of the sea. In the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, piracy thrived for centuries along the coasts of Arabia, East Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. These routes had long been vital arteries of global trade, carrying spices, textiles, ivory, incense, and pearls between Asia, Africa, and Europe. For most of history, there were no clearly marked borders on the sea, only shifting tides of power. Local rulers, traders, and seafarers operated in a delicate balance of competition and cooperation. Piracy was part of this ecosystem, a recurring feature rather than a fixed threat. Some of the most quietly powerful figures in this region were the Malabar pirates of Western India, who operated with the support or tolerance of regional leaders. They targeted European merchant ships, especially Portuguese vessels, often redistributing goods into local markets. Their actions blurred the line between piracy and resistance. For many, attacking colonial ships was not criminal. It was a defense of sovereignty, a rebalancing of trade, disrupted by foreign empires. Further east, the waters around the Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest maritime choke points in the world, became home to powerful pirate clans. These groups, operating from hidden bases among the islands of what is now Indonesia and Malaysia, knew the strait's labyrinthine channels better than any foreign navigator. European ships passing through were at constant risk, not only because of the threat of attack, but because these pirates were sometimes allied with local kingdoms. Like their Atlantic counterparts, they existed in a liminal space, tolerated, empowered, and occasionally celebrated by communities who benefited from their presence. But perhaps the most remarkable pirate empire emerged in the South China Sea in the early 19th century. At its center was a woman named Qing Shi, a name that still carries quiet awe in the history of seafaring. Once a prostitute in Canton, she married a powerful pirate commander, and after his sudden death, assumed control of his vast confederation. Through a combination of diplomacy, strict discipline, and sharp intelligence, she united rival pirate fleets under a single banner. At its height, her organization, the Red Flag Fleet, commanded hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors. Her authority was absolute. She established a strict code of conduct. Captured villages were not to be pillaged without permission. Female captives were to be treated with respect, and violations were harshly punished. Qing Shi's fleet defeated both Chinese and European naval forces. In time, recognizing that she could not be bested by force, the Qing government offered her amnesty. She accepted, negotiated favorable terms, and retired peacefully, keeping her wealth and opening a gambling house. Her life, almost entirely free of myth, was no less extraordinary for it. Meanwhile, along the coast of East Africa, a different kind of piracy was taking shape. Swahili city-states like Kilwa, Zanzibar, and Mombasa had long histories as trading powers, blending African, Arab, and Persian influences. Pirates in this region often came in the form of raiders or smugglers who challenged Portuguese control. Some operated independently, while others were loosely affiliated with local dynasties. The trade here was different, focused on gold, ivory, and enslaved people, and so too were the patterns of conflict. Yet the rhythms of resistance and self-determination remained familiar. Even in the distant Pacific Ocean, piracy and raiding were integral to indigenous cultures long before European contact. In Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, maritime warfare and raiding played roles in inter-island relations. Canoes carved from massive trees carried warriors and goods across vast stretches of sea. These were not pirates in the European sense, but the themes of mobility, strategy, and fluid power echoed across cultures. And in Japan, during the chaotic centuries of internal strife before unification, groups of seafaring raiders known as wako or wako struck along the coasts of Korea and China. These pirates were a blend of Japanese, Chinese, and sometimes Korean outlaws, merchants, and former soldiers. At times, their raids were so frequent and destructive that entire coastal regions were abandoned or fortified in response. Like the Caribbean buccaneers, they thrived in moments of political disarray, slipping through the cracks of falling regimes and fractured allegiances. Throughout all of these regions, one pattern remains quietly clear. Piracy emerged most often when centralized power faltered, when trade brought wealth unevenly, and when the margins of empire created both opportunity and injustice. Whether on a Chinese junk, an Arabian dhow, or an Indonesian proa, pirates navigated a world in flux, using the sea as both shield and sword. There is something inherently mournful about a ship at rest. Sails furled, anchor dropped, crew vanished. And so it was too with the pirates who once filled the ocean with movement and noise. Their lives, so often marked by speed, change, and defiance, ended most often in stillness. Whether by the hangman's noose, the slow erosion of disease, or the endless horizon of exile, Many pirates met their end far from family, far from fame, and often far from the waters that had defined them. The most common death for a pirate was not in battle, but by sickness. Aboard ships where fresh water was limited and nutrition often poor, diseases like scurvy, dysentery, typhus, and malaria were frequent visitors. A simple wound, left untreated, could become fatal in days. Death at sea was so expected that many crews developed their own rituals around it, not formal, not ecclesiastical, but respectful in their own way. A sailor who died aboard ship might be sewn into his hammock, weighted with cannonballs or stones, and committed to the sea. A few brief words might be spoken, sometimes religious, sometimes not. The body would slide into the water, disappearing beneath the waves without a marker. In those moments, the ocean became both grave and witness. There were no headstones, no epitaphs, just the slow rhythm of the tide, taking one of its own. For those who died ashore, the story could be different. In rare cases, pirates were buried in makeshift cemeteries near coastal settlements, their graves often unmarked or marked only with stones. Some were laid to rest on hidden islands known only to their crew. These resting places were typically chosen for their obscurity, a stretch of beach known for solitude, or a forest clearing far from the paths of colonial patrols. Yet, not all burials were peaceful. Executed pirates, particularly those captured by British, Spanish, or Dutch authorities, were often denied the dignity of a proper resting place. Their bodies were displayed in public as a warning to others, sometimes hung in gibbets, iron cages that suspended the corpse over the harbor. The practice, both gruesome and theatrical, was meant to instill fear and show the might of law. These silent sentinels, creaking in the wind, were once a common sight at the entrances to colonial ports like Kingston, Charleston, and London. Among the most chilling of these sights was Execution Dock on the River Thames in London, where many condemned pirates were hanged. Unlike criminals on land, pirates were considered enemies of all nations, hostis humani generis, or enemies of mankind. Their executions were public affairs, drawing large crowds. After death, their bodies were sometimes tarred to slow decomposition and hung over the river for weeks. Yet even here, in the midst of this spectacle, moments of humanity flickered. Some spectators wept, some turned away. Some whispered that the man hanging above them had once been kind, or brave, or simply unlucky. A few pirates made peace with their fate. Stade Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate, wrote letters from his prison cell, expressing remorse and gratitude for the kindness of strangers. Others defied their captors until the end. Charles Vane, ever defiant, remained unrepentant even as he faced the noose. Each faced death in his own way, shaped by belief, pride, or exhaustion. And though their bodies may have vanished, the places of their deaths remained imprinted in docks, in court records, in stories passed through generations. Some pirates, remarkably, died in old age, retired, obscure, their names forgotten by all but a few. They settled in small towns or coastal villages, sometimes under assumed identities. They became shipbuilders, fishermen, innkeepers. They lived quietly, their stories folded into the background hum of colonial life. For them, the end came not with cannon fire or curses, but with silence, a final anchorage after years at sea. And still others, like Qingxi, died with wealth and dignity, having outmaneuvered empires and survived on their own terms. Her death was not marked by punishment or disgrace, but by comfort, a rare ending for a pirate and a testament to her skill. Her life reminds us that not all pirate stories are tragedies. Some are simply human journeys, full of complexity, compromise, and quiet triumph. What remains most striking
is how little we truly know of where most pirates were laid to rest. The sea, as ever, keeps its secrets. Sound covers graves. Storms erase memory. Time smooths away the sharp edges of even the most dramatic lives. Yet in scattered corners of the world, in lonely coves, in overgrown burial grounds, beneath the waters of forgotten harbors, their stories still hum faintly, not in gold or glory, but in the memory of choices made at the edge of the world. The final legacy of a pirate was rarely written in stone. It lived instead in the stories whispered aboard ships, in the songs sung quietly on night watches, and in the enduring mystery of lives lived just beyond the reach of rule. Their deaths were varied, often tragic, sometimes peaceful, but always part of something larger, the long, slow rhythm of the sea, and the way it takes in all who venture too far from shore.
There is a kind of hush that falls over a ship when it nears land after weeks at sea, a shift in the air, a new scent on the wind, and a distant line on the horizon that promises fresh food, dry ground, and the comfort of other voices. For pirates, landfall was not simply a necessity, it was a release, a return, and at times, a risk. The ports they entered were not always lawful, and the towns that welcomed them did so with a kind of unspoken agreement. Goods in, money spent, questions few. Some of these places are well known to history, names spoken often in tales of treasure and infamy. Others, small and unnamed, appear only in passing journal entries or fragmentary records. But all served the same purpose. They were the lungs of pirate life, where ships could breathe, where men could remember they were still part of the world. Port Royal on the southern coast of Jamaica was perhaps the most notorious of these harbors. In the late 1600s, it thrived not just as a strategic English stronghold, but as a bustling center of commerce, legal and otherwise. Here, pirates offloaded stolen goods, refitted their ships, and filled the narrow streets with their voices. The town teemed with taverns, gambling halls, and brothels, earning it the nickname the wickedest city in the world. Yet, for all its vice, Port Royal was not chaos. It was a complex organism, a port where pirate wealth flowed into colonial economies, and where respect was often measured by reputation, not rank. In 1692, a devastating earthquake struck Port Royal, sending large sections of the town into the sea. Buildings vanished beneath the waves, streets cracked open, and many lives were lost. Some saw it as divine retribution, others simply moved the business inland. But even in ruin, the memory of Port Royal endured, a place where the rules of empire bent, if only for a time. Further north, the island of New Providence in the Bahamas became another pirate haven. After being mostly abandoned by colonial powers, it was occupied by pirates who transformed the settlement of Nassau into a loosely governed community. For years, it operated under its own code, a kind of anarchic republic where ships came and went freely, captains were elected, and wealth flowed unpredictably through the narrow, sunlit streets. Nassau was more than a place to spend loot. It was a refuge. Pirates wounded in battle could recover there. Crews split by mutiny could reform. Ships damaged by storms could be patched, repainted, and renamed. The town became a hub, not only of trade, but of intelligence. News from across the Atlantic passed through in whispers and shouted boasts, shaping decisions made far out at sea. Along the coast of Madagascar, halfway around the world, another community quietly grew. Île Sainte-Marie, a small island off the eastern shore, became a favored stop for pirates in the Indian Ocean. There, in the early 1700s, a kind of pirate colony emerged, small, scattered, and self-sustaining.
Some pirates even married into local communities, blurring the lines between outsider and resident. Though no grand fortresses were built, the island provided everything a ship might need: fresh water, food, shelter, and space to disappear. Graves still remain there, their stones worn by sea air, bearing the faded symbols of seafarers long gone. In all these places, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Madagascar, and beyond, the tavern was the true heart of pirate life ashore. These were not grand halls, but low-ceilinged, lantern-lit rooms with dirt floors, rough tables, and the ever-present smell of salt, smoke, and sweat. Rum flowed freely, music rose from corners, and deals were struck in quiet voices. Taverns were where new crews formed, where stolen goods changed hands, where betrayals began and romances sparked. For many pirates, it was the one place where the mask could slip, where they could laugh too loudly, mourn too openly, or simply rest without a hand on the hilt of a blade. But not all port visits were joyful. In some places, pirates were hunted, not welcomed. Colonial governors, once complicit, grew cautious. Naval officers arrived with orders and lists of names. A familiar town could turn hostile in a single day, and a friendly merchant might become an informant. Still, pirates returned to shore because they had to, for supplies, for news, for human connection. And always, in the back of the mind, was the knowledge that land offered both safety and danger in equal measure. Relationships formed in these harbors, some lasting, others fleeting. Pirates took lovers, left behind children, or supported families from afar. Some tried to settle, tempted by stillness after years of movement. A few even succeeded, but most returned to the sea, drawn by the familiar roll of the waves, the creak of the rigging, and the pull of a life that could never quite be replaced. And so these harbors, half forgotten now, held something more than trade. They held memory. The worn beams of an old tavern might once have heard the planning of a raid that would echo in history. The beach where goats now wander might once have been littered with barrels offloaded in secret. The crumbling pier, half swallowed by vines, may have been the last place a pirate ever stood on land. These were not just waypoints on a map, but the quiet spaces where pirate life touched the world, where gold changed hands, names were spoken, and stories began or ended with the rising tide.
Out on the open sea, before the thunder of cannons or the clash of steel, came a moment of silence, a kind of suspended breath between two ships, and in that stillness, the flag rose. It was not always black, not always adorned with skulls, but its meaning was unmistakable. The pirate flag, known to history as the Jolly Roger, was both a threat and a warning, and sometimes a final offer of mercy. The earliest pirate flags were not standardized. There was no official design, no code of shapes and colors. Instead, they were personal, improvisational, and deeply symbolic. Some were black, signaling death, while others were red, the so-called bloody flag, which warned that no quarter would be given. A red flag meant the crew intended to take no prisoners, and any resistance would be met with immediate brutal force. A ship seeing a red banner might surrender on sight, if only to avoid the fate it promised. More commonly, however, the black flag became the signature of pirate ships. Within that black field, individual captains added symbols that reflected their style, their warnings, or their beliefs. The most familiar icon, the skull and crossbones, was not the only one used. Some featured hourglasses, a quiet reminder that time was running out. Others included swords, spears, bleeding hearts, or skeletons raising goblets, as if to toast death itself. Edward England, for example, used a simple skull above crossed bones on a black background, direct and unmistakable. Calico Jack Rackham preferred crossed swords beneath a skull, a design that has since become one of the most enduring pirate emblems. Bartholomew Roberts, ever a man of precision, had two flags, one showing him standing with a skeleton holding an hourglass, and another with him presenting a flaming sword to a bound captive. Each flag spoke a language, not of nation, but of intention. But the use of flags was more than symbolic. It was strategic. Pirates often approached under false colors, flying the flag of a friendly or neutral nation until they were within striking distance. Only then would they raise the black flag, sometimes accompanied by a cannon shot across the bow, a moment meant to inspire surrender, not combat. Pirates, after all, were not in the business of prolonged naval warfare. They wanted cargo, not corpses, speed, not siege. The raising of the Jolly Roger was often enough to compel a merchant crew to give up without a fight. Many ships, especially those undermanned or lightly armed, chose to surrender rather than risk the wrath of pirates known for efficiency and occasional cruelty. In this sense, the flag was not only a signal of danger, it was a tool of psychological warfare, crafted to avoid bloodshed through fear. That said, the effectiveness of the flag depended on the reputation behind it. A black banner flown by a notorious pirate carried more weight than one flown by an unknown crew. Tales of certain captains spread across ports like wildfire, amplified by rumor and exaggerated in taverns. The name on the wind could terrify more than the flag itself. A ship hearing that Blackbeard was near might flee at the first sign of an unfamiliar sail, or mistake a lesser crew for him, simply based on the design of their flag. Flags were also a point of identity for pirate crews. In a world without citizenship, without stable allegiance, the flag became a kind of home, a symbol of shared purpose and chosen rebellion. Some ships voted on their designs. Others carried flags painted by crew members, stitched from scraps of sailcloth and dyed with soot, ash, or blood. These were not factory-made emblems, but personal declarations, handmade, weather-beaten, and fluttering with intent. Not every pirate ship flew a flag at all times. When the wind was against them or stealth was needed, banners were lowered. In the stillness of dawn or the cover of fog, a silent approach was more valuable than a boastful warning. But when the time came, when sails were trimmed and decks cleared for engagement, the flag would rise, not for spectacle, but for clarity. It said simply, "We are not bound by your laws. We answer only to ourselves." Over time, the flag took on a kind of mythic power. It became shorthand for all that piracy represented: defiance, danger, and freedom at a cost. And as piracy faded, the Jolly Roger remained, lingering in cultural memory long after the ships were gone. It appeared on book covers, on bottle labels, in children's stories and naval tradition. Even some modern military units have adopted variations of the symbol, invoking the audacity and independence it once promised. Yet in its original form, aboard the creaking mast of a real pirate vessel, the flag was not just theater, it was a living language, a message between ships, a choice offered across the water, and in the soft light of morning, when sails filled with wind and the future lay uncertain on the tide, it told the truth in its own quiet way, that this crew had made their own path, and that anyone in their way would have to choose, fight, flee, or fall in line. As the last real pirate ships vanished from the seas, their stories began a second life, not in ports or courtrooms, but in the minds of storytellers. What had once been a living trade, full of noise and danger and sweat, became something softer, more symbolic. Pirates moved from history into folklore, and from there into literature, theater,
and eventually cinema. Along the way, their edges were smoothed, their morals reimagined, and their voices, once rough with salt and defiance, were shaped into something familiar, almost comforting, like a tale told by firelight, or a dream too vivid to forget. Much of this transformation began with the publication of a general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates in 1724, attributed to the mysterious Captain Charles Johnson. This book, blending eyewitness detail with embellishment, was one of the first to elevate pirates from criminal records to lasting characters. It provided rich, dramatic accounts of figures like Blackbeard, Bonny and Bartholomew Roberts, presenting them not only as rogues but as complex personalities, sometimes cruel, sometimes honorable, always compelling. Whether Johnson's stories were strictly true mattered less than the way they made readers feel, as if they had glimpsed another world, dangerous but oddly free. From there, the line between history and myth blurred. In the 19th century, as the age of empires settled into the age of nostalgia, pirates became perfect figures for an era hungry for adventure. Treasure Island, penned by Robert Louis Stevenson in 1883, brought pirate fantasy into the literary mainstream, with its secret maps, hidden islands, and unforgettable characters like Long John Silver. Cunning, charismatic, and morally ambiguous, the book crystallized many of the symbols we now associate with piracy: peg legs, parrots, treasure chests, and the iconic cry of yo-ho-ho. Children devoured these tales, and adults found in them a reflection of deeper questions about greed, loyalty, and what it meant to be free. Pirate stories came to represent not just the danger of the sea, but the tension between law and liberty, duty and desire. The pirate was not just a villain or a hero, but something in between, a mirror held up to society's rules, showing what happens when one steps outside them. As the 20th century arrived, pirates took on new forms, first in silent films, then in swashbuckling classics of Hollywood's Golden Age. Actors like Errol Flynn brought flair and charisma to the pirate image, leaping across decks and dueling with grace. The sea, once a place of grime and hardship, was transformed into a stage for romance and adventure. In these films, pirates often stood for more than gold. They represented the outsider, the rebel with charm, the man or woman who dared to live differently. Of course, much was lost in translation. The diversity of real pirate crews, with their mixture of races, languages, and genders, was often erased or flattened into caricature. The violence and complexity of their lives were simplified, and the cultures they encountered or harmed were frequently ignored. But something deeper persisted: the idea of the pirate as someone who moved against the tide, whose compass pointed not north, but toward choice. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, pirate lore continued to evolve. Films like Pirates of the Caribbean reintroduced the image to a new generation, now more magical, more humorous, yet still tied to that original tension between control and freedom. The pirate became, once again, a symbol, not of historical accuracy, but of possibility. A figure who existed, not in dusty books, but in the imagination, sailing still through fog and moonlight. Outside of fiction, pirate festivals began to appear in coastal towns, celebrating not crime, but community. People dressed in tricorn hats and sashes spoke in invented accents and toasted a shared love of the sea. In this context, piracy had become almost folkloric, akin to Robin Hood or King Arthur, a tale told not to replicate the past, but to feel close to it. The pirate's life, once feared and hunted, was now remembered in laughter and song. Yet even in play, the pirate story retains its echo. Beneath the costumes and the tales, there remains a quiet recognition that piracy was never just about treasure or even the sea. It was about people at the edge of the world, making choices with few good options. It was about survival, dignity, defiance, and at times, hope. And it was about the stories people leave behind, not always accurate, but meaningful nonetheless. These stories still move, like ships caught in unseen currents. They travel in bedtime books, in films watched under blankets, in sea shanties hummed on long drives, in tattoos etched on weathered skin. They whisper of danger, of laughter, of longing, and always, just beneath the surface, they carry a question: what would you do if the map was blank and the wind was in your favor? The answer changes with every telling. That is the beauty of folklore. It bends, but does not break. It sails on, its sails patched with memory, its hull creaking with truth and fiction alike, bound for no port, anchored only in the human heart.
Though their reign was brief and their numbers small, pirates left an outsized imprint on the world, not only in the stories passed down through generations, but in the quiet mechanisms of trade, law, and governance that would come to define the modern age. Their influence was not just in what they took, but in what they revealed: vulnerabilities in empires, hypocrisies in law, and possibilities in freedom. By challenging the established order, they forced that order to evolve. At the height of the Golden Age, pirates disrupted more than just individual voyages. They shook the economic foundations of transatlantic commerce. European nations, growing rich from colonial trade, depended heavily on steady routes and secure ports. Spanish silver, British tobacco, Dutch spices, all flowed through narrow arteries across the oceans. Pirates, nimble and unregulated, inserted themselves into these networks like clots in a bloodstream. With a single raid, they could interrupt a shipment months in the making, cause prices to spike, or damage a merchant's reputation for reliability. This unpredictability, though dangerous for empires, created opportunity for others. Some colonial economies quietly benefited from pirate activity, especially in frontier settlements where official trade was scarce. Stolen goods entered local markets through back doors and secret alleys, enriching tavern owners, dockworkers, and black market traders. Over time, this shadow economy grew robust enough to influence policy. Governors who once condemned piracy might hesitate to enforce bans too strongly, knowing the economic benefits of tolerating such men, especially in regions far from the scrutiny of distant capitals. But piracy also forced legal innovation. The Admiralty courts, which handled maritime offenses, evolved significantly during the age of piracy. These courts began streamlining trials, redefining jurisdiction, and emphasizing evidence over tradition. They expanded the idea of piracy from mere theft to a broader category of crimes against order and commerce. By trying pirates publicly, and often harshly, colonial governments sent a message, but they also set precedents. Some of these legal structures remain embedded in international maritime law to this day. Pirates also raised difficult questions about sovereignty. A ship was a floating nation, in many ways, a microcosm where authority had to be negotiated, enforced, or earned. On pirate ships, the absence of formal allegiance created room for experiment. Crews elected their captains. They established codes, divided plunder according to agreed shares, and removed leaders who abused power. These floating democracies, fragile and flawed as they were, prefigured broader movements to come. Though few pirates would have called themselves revolutionaries, their insistence on self-governance resonated, quietly, deeply, in a world increasingly restless with monarchy and empire. And then there were the cultural aftershocks. The image of the pirate, so compelling in its contradictions, violent yet egalitarian, free yet doomed, took root in the imagination of those far from the coast. Political pamphlets,
adventure novels, and whispered rumors painted pirates as everything from freedom fighters to devils incarnate. In taverns and marketplaces, songs spread their stories. In port towns, children played pirate not just to mimic danger, but to explore what it meant to choose one's own path. This legacy of choice, of rejecting the life one was given for the uncertain freedom of the sea, struck a chord that still echoes today. Many pirates came from harsh conditions: former slaves, disenfranchised sailors, indentured laborers, or escaped convicts. To them, piracy was not simply a crime. It was a refusal, a quiet rebellion against the roles society had scripted. Their very existence posed a question that haunted the empires they challenged. What if people, when pushed too far, chose another way? Yet it would be a mistake to romanticize piracy completely. These were not utopians. They stole, sometimes violently. They enslaved others even as some among them had once been enslaved. They punished betrayal ruthlessly, and their codes were as capable of cruelty as any colonial charter. But within that moral ambiguity lies their true influence. Pirates did not pretend to be pure. They exposed the contradictions in the systems that pursued them, empires that condemned theft but enriched themselves through conquest, that hung pirates while subsidizing slavers, that invoked law while profiting from chaos. In doing so, pirates helped illuminate the shadows of the age. They showed that power could be challenged, that freedom came with cost, and that the sea, vast, lawless, indifferent, remained a space where new forms of life might briefly, brilliantly appear. And so, long after their ships were burned and their bones scattered across foreign sands, the ideas they touched continued to ripple outward, into law, into literature, into legend, and into the quiet corners of the modern world, where questions of power, justice, and freedom still drift, like fog, across the surface of the sea.
While history tends to remember captains, their names carved into books and shouted across centuries, most pirate ships were carried forward by quieter hands. These were the ordinary sailors, the nameless crewmen who stitched sails, loaded cannons, stood watch beneath the stars, and made decisions that rarely made the official logs. They didn't give speeches. They didn't wear plumed hats. Yet without them, no flag would have flown, no course would have held, and no legend would have lasted more than a single wave. The typical pirate crew was a patchwork of humanity, sailors with vastly different languages, skin tones, and life stories. Many were former merchant seamen or naval deserters, drawn not by dreams of gold, but by the whisper of better treatment. Aboard a pirate ship, the rules were rough but clear, and the promise of fair shares and a voice in decisions stood in stark contrast to the often brutal hierarchies of naval and merchant vessels. In truth, life in the Royal Navy or aboard a merchant ship could be little more than sanctioned servitude. Sailors were flogged for minor offenses, paid meager wages that were frequently delayed or denied, and kept in conditions only just above survival. Discipline was absolute, and the officers were often distant, cold, and violent. Against this, piracy offered not just gold, but a chance to be treated like a person, a small dignity that drew thousands to risk everything. Aboard a pirate vessel, decisions were often put to a vote, especially those concerning leadership, destinations, and shares of plunder. Every crew member had a stake. The ship's articles, those agreed upon codes of conduct, protected the interests of even the lowest-ranked sailor. If a man lost a limb in battle, he was compensated. If loot was divided, every man received a fair share, with only modest bonuses to the captain and quartermaster. It was, in many ways, a floating republic. Below deck, life was cramped and simple. Hammocks swayed side by side in the dark, damp belly of the ship.
There was little privacy and constant noise, the thud of waves, the creak of timbers, the coughs and snores of tired men. Rats scurried, lanterns smoked, and salt clung to every surface. Yet in this space, bonds were formed, meals were shared, jokes exchanged, stories told in low voices. One sailor might be from the highlands of Scotland, another from a sugar plantation in Barbados, another from the coast of West Africa, but at sea they became shipmates, bound together by wind, rope, and chance. The division of labor aboard a pirate ship was practical and respected. Gunners, riggers, cooks, carpenters, and sailmakers all played essential roles. A good boatswain kept order and inspected equipment. A skilled navigator, often just called the sailing master, could make or break a voyage. These men were chosen not by birth, but by skill. There was no noble rank, no inherited privilege, only usefulness and the trust of the crew. Among these working sailors were men who had once been enslaved. Some escaped during raids on slaving ships. Others were freed by pirate captains or bought their way to freedom. In pirate crews, they often became equals, respected for their seamanship, courage, or quiet wisdom. Though the world above water was structured by race and caste, the world below deck, rocked by tide and necessity, often bent toward something more egalitarian, though never perfectly. Disputes among the crew were inevitable. Life at sea was stressful, dangerous, and often boring. Tempers flared over shares, insults, or small slights. Fights broke out, sometimes settled by duels or mediation. Yet many ships had rules for conflict resolution, dueling at dawn on the next shore, or fines deducted from plunder. Justice was rough, but it aimed to preserve the crew's cohesion. A broken crew meant a dead ship. For those who served in pirate crews long enough, the sea became home, not just the physical space of the ocean, but the strange, suspended reality of the ship itself. Days bled into nights, and the rhythms of life grew familiar. Watch shifts, meals, maintenance, and long stretches of conversation under open sky. These men developed a quiet expertise. They could read the sea by smell, sense storms in the air pressure, splice rope in the dark, and repair sails with numb fingers during gales. Their knowledge was deep, unspoken, and often unrecorded, passed through demonstration, not instruction. When pirates were caught and tried, these men were often the ones executed first. Captains, if they surrendered, might negotiate. Officers might testify, but common sailors with no names known to the authorities and no voices in court faced the rope swiftly. Their deaths were rarely noted, their bodies discarded without ceremony, yet their fingerprints remained in the knots of the rigging, the powder-burned cannon decks, and the salt-worn planks of ships that would not have sailed without them. Today, the names of these men are mostly gone, dissolved like salt into the sea, but their lives remain threaded through the fabric of pirate history, not as bold headlines or infamous legends, but as the steady rhythm beneath the story. The ones who made the sails catch wind, who stood watch through bitter storms, and who, in the silence before battle, glanced at one another, not with fear, but with the calm of those who knew what it meant to choose, together, the life they had. To the land-bound world, ships were symbols of exploration, commerce, or empire, but to pirates, a ship was something far more intimate. It was home and hope, defense and escape, a platform for independence, and sometimes for reinvention. Every inch of wood, every line of rigging, every cannon and hammock space had a purpose, and together they created the fragile floating lives that piracy depended on.
Understanding pirate ships is to understand the balance of danger and delicacy in a life lived between waves. Unlike naval warships or merchant galleons, pirate ships were rarely built from scratch. They were captured, seized, or repurposed, altered over time to suit the needs of a crew that valued speed, agility, and surprise above all else. In most cases, pirates avoided the heavy, lumbering vessels of the European powers. These might carry more firepower, but they were slow, unwieldy, and poorly suited to the cat-and-mouse game that piracy required. Instead, pirates favored ships that were small, fast, and maneuverable, vessels like sloops, brigantines, and schooners. These ships could navigate shallow waters, slip between reefs, and disappear quickly when danger loomed. A shallow draft allowed access to hidden inlets and coves where larger ships couldn't follow. For pirates, mobility was survival. They didn't need to win prolonged battles. They needed to strike quickly and be gone before help arrived. One of the most feared pirate vessels of the Golden Age was Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge, a former French slave ship converted into a floating fortress. Armed with up to 40 guns and carrying a large, seasoned crew, it was both powerful and intimidating. But even Blackbeard, bold as he was, eventually ran her aground, perhaps deliberately, and returned to smaller, faster craft, better suited to the changing tides of piracy's twilight years. Most pirate ships were less dramatic in scale, but no less carefully maintained. Life aboard required constant repair. Salt and wind wore down sails. Wood warped and cracked. Cannon mounts needed reinforcement. Pirates might trade with coastal craftsmen, salvage parts from captured ships, or improvise with whatever materials they had on hand. A good carpenter or sailmaker was as valued as any gunner, and their work was never done. Weapons were carefully arranged. Cannons lined the sides, but not always in overwhelming numbers. A balance had to be struck. Too many guns made a ship heavy and slow. Instead, pirates often relied on speed and intimidation, closing the gap quickly, firing a single devastating broadside, and boarding before the enemy could react. For close combat, muskets, pistols, grenades, and cutlasses were kept ready at hand, stowed in boxes on deck, or slung across belts, loaded and primed. Rigging was also crucial. Pirates depended on sails to escape pursuit, and any tear could spell disaster. Crews learned to climb and move through the rigging with ease, adjusting sails in the thick of battle or the height of a storm. A skilled sailor might leap into the ropes mid-chase, tying off a sheet or cutting loose a tangled line with a small knife gripped between his teeth. Every moment counted. Every knot mattered. Below deck, the ship transformed from weapon to shelter. Here were the hammocks, the stores of food and powder, the small chests of personal belongings, trinkets from home, a spare shirt, a pipe, a few coins hidden for the future. Space was limited. Privacy was nearly non-existent. And yet, in that crowded hold, a strange comfort could be found. The gentle sway of the ship became a lullaby. The sound of creaking timber, once foreign, became familiar, a reminder that one was still afloat, still alive. Ships were also sites of ritual. When a new vessel was taken, a renaming ceremony might take place. A bottle of rum broken on the bow, a cheer from the crew, a new flag raised high. These acts were more than symbolic. They marked a change in fate. A stolen ship, once a tool of empire or commerce, was now something else entirely. A pirate ship, reborn into a life of autonomy and risk. Sometimes crews would modify their vessels to appear more ordinary, painting over pirate markings, flying false flags, or disguising cannon ports. Deception was as much a part of their toolkit as gunpowder.
In other cases, a pirate ship might be made to look more threatening than it really was. Its deck crowded with dummies dressed as crew, its sails cut for speed, its cannon ports exaggerated. The goal was always the same: control the narrative before a single shot was fired. But a pirate ship was also its own kind of prison. Once at sea, there was no escape. Crews had to trust each other, and the ship itself, with their lives. A leaking hull, a snapped mast, or a fire below deck could mean the end. For all their bravado, pirates lived with constant awareness of how vulnerable a ship truly was. Every storm tested the seams, every pursuit stretched the rigging, and when things went wrong, there was no cavalry, only the crew, the wind, and the sea. Still, for those who called these ships home, the bond was deep. The ship was not just a means of plunder, it was the world. It carried them into battle and away from it, sheltered them from storms and from the reach of kings. They climbed its masts like limbs of a tree, patched its sails like skin, walked its decks like old roads, and when the end came, through capture, shipwreck, or mutiny, it was often the ship's failure, not the crew's, that brought it on.
Though pirate ships roamed the oceans freely for a time, they were never entirely outside the reach of the world they rejected. Across the 17th and 18th centuries, a quieter battle unfolded, not fought with cannonballs, but with words, rulings, and the relentless spread of legal systems into every corner of the sea. To fight piracy, empires built not just navies, but definitions. They passed laws, issued pardons, created courts, and slowly but surely wrapped the loose threads of outlawry in official knots. In the eyes of the law, piracy was a unique crime. It was not merely theft or murder. It was defined as hostis humani generis, an enemy of all mankind. This meant that pirates, unlike other criminals, could be tried by any nation, in any port, no matter where the crime occurred. There was no need for jurisdiction in the usual sense. This legal status made pirates both more dangerous and more vulnerable. They had no allies, no protections, and no recourse once captured. It also gave courts wide latitude to interpret their actions, often harshly. To process this new category of outlaw, admiralty courts expanded their reach. These maritime tribunals, held in coastal cities from London to Boston to Kingston, were established to try offences committed at sea. Proceedings were often swift and unforgiving. A few witnesses, a brief statement from the accused, sometimes made in chains, and a sentence. Convictions often led to public execution, followed by the grim ritual of gibbeting, where the condemned man's body was displayed in an iron cage near the harbour. Yet the legal system also offered a strange sort of lifeline: the royal pardon. Throughout the early 18th century, European monarchs issued decrees offering amnesty to pirates willing to surrender. These proclamations, posted in coastal towns or read aloud in public squares, promised forgiveness in exchange for peace, but only once. A pirate who returned to his trade after accepting pardon was considered doubly guilty and doubly damned. Some took the offer. The once feared pirate Benjamin Hornigold, for example, accepted a pardon and even worked later to hunt former allies. Others, like Charles Vane, rejected the pardon outright and paid the price. For many, it was a gamble. Accepting pardon might bring a brief return to shore life, but with little money, few skills, and constant suspicion. Returning to piracy could offer fortune or death. Either way, their names were already etched on lists circulated between governors and naval officers. Legal language around piracy was often broad and intentionally vague. A sailor caught aboard a pirate ship, even against his will, might be deemed guilty by association. A merchant who unknowingly purchased stolen goods
could be fined or imprisoned. A coastal tavern owner who served a known pirate might find himself interrogated, or worse. This created an atmosphere of quiet fear, even as it tightened the state's grip on the edges of empire. The paperwork left behind from these proceedings offers a curious window into pirate life. Court transcripts, depositions, pardon rolls, and shipping records show not just names and dates, but moments of human clarity. A pirate testifying on behalf of a wounded crewmate, a ship's boy begging for clemency, a governor weighing mercy against reputation. These records, dry as they may seem at first glance, pulse with drama and sorrow, the final words of people who once sailed free, now reduced to names on parchment. In some cases, legal records preserved the voices of pirates in their own words. William Fly, hanged in Boston in 1726, used his final moments to denounce the abuse of sailors by cruel captains, arguing that piracy was not born of greed, but of injustice. His words, scribbled down by a minister or court clerk, offer a rare glimpse into the philosophy of a condemned man. He asked not to be mourned, but to be understood. The use of law to suppress piracy also had broader implications. It marked a turning point in the way states extended their reach beyond land, using not just ships, but language to claim authority over oceans. Treaties between nations began to include provisions about piracy. Maritime insurance grew more complex, reflecting the risk of pirate attack, and coastal fortifications were rebuilt, not only with guns but with customs houses, clerk offices, and holding cells. The sea was no longer a place apart. It was becoming mapped, measured, and managed. Still, the word pirate remained slippery. To some, it meant criminal, to others, hero. During times of war, privateers, state-sanctioned pirates, operated under legal charters, attacking enemy ships with full approval. Yet once peace returned, the same captains might find themselves labeled outlaws for continuing the very same work. The line between pirate and privateer was razor-thin and often drawn by politics, not morality. In time, piracy was pushed to the margins, into quieter coves, narrower straits, or distant oceans where law traveled more slowly, but it was never fully extinguished. The legal war on piracy did not erase the practice. It merely made it more cautious, more hidden, more complex. And in doing so, it forced the world to reckon not just with pirates, but with the systems that made them and the rules that struggled to contain them. Long before maps drew borders across it, long before sails split its winds, the ocean stretched out, vast, ancient, and unknowable. It was never truly empty, but always wide enough to feel so. To the pirates who carved brief lives into its surface, the sea was more than backdrop. It was everything. It fed and killed, hid and revealed. It was a place where power vanished, where laws became abstract, and where time itself seemed to stretch, loop, or dissolve into the rhythm of waves. Aboard a pirate ship, one learned quickly that the ocean was both home and hazard. Its moods changed without warning. One day it lay still, shimmering like molten glass, holding the ship in place under a brutal sun. The next it rose in fury, flinging men from decks and turning masts into spears. There were no guarantees. Even the best sailor could be swallowed by a sudden squall. Even the most fortified vessel could founder on a hidden reef. Yet pirates chose this world, or, more often, found themselves remade by it. The sea offered something that land did not: movement, vastness, and a chance to slip between the cracks of empire. On land, one might be hunted, jailed, enslaved, or forgotten. At sea, at least for a while, there was space to breathe. A ship under sail was a kind of floating rebellion, not just against kings and captains, but against the limits of birth, class, and expectation. Still, the sea demanded everything. Navigation required patience and nerve. Pirates studied stars, winds, currents, and clouds with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. A good navigator was worth more than gold, for he could read the world in signs most could not see. A thin line of cloud on the horizon might mean land. The sudden silence of seabirds could warn of a coming storm. Even the smell of the air changed with depth and direction. The ocean spoke, if one learned to listen. There were superstitions, of course, not born of ignorance, but of hard-earned respect. Whistling on deck could summon wind, or worse, a ship renamed without ritual might bring disaster. Animals on board were omens as much as companions, a cat for luck, a rat infestation as a warning. Dead, calm seas could be more terrifying than hurricanes, for they stretched endlessly without progress or relief. Weeks without wind could strip the mind raw, leaving sailors pacing decks under blazing skies, listening to the ship creak and sigh as if impatient to move. In such moments, silence became a kind of presence. Pirates lived among noise, the slap of sails, the murmur of crews, the crack of rope. But they also knew the deep stillness of the sea at night, stars above like frost, water below like ink, and nothing but breath and memory between. It was in those moments that many sailors felt closest to something greater than themselves, not always a god, but something vast and listening. A kind of oldness that dwarfed even the boldest pirate name. The sea also held secrets. Wrecks drifted below, unseen but not forgotten. Some pirates died in storms and were never found. Others scuttled their own ships to avoid capture, choosing to vanish beneath the waves rather than face the noose. To this day, divers still uncover fragments, a rusted cannon, a coin pressed into silt, the ribs of a ship buried beneath coral. These pieces do not shout. They whisper. They say, someone lived here, someone dared. For many pirates, the ocean was the only constant. Ports shifted, alliances broke, fortunes changed. But the sea remained, cool in the morning, glowing at dusk, silvered by moonlight. It shaped their language, their bones, their sense of time. Days were counted by sun and wind, not by calendar. Decisions were made by sky and swell, not clock or law. A pirate crew lived not by the rhythms of the empire, but by the rhythm of the tide. And when death came, as it always did, the sea often took them back. A body sewn into canvas, weighted with shot, slid silently into the deep. No gravestone, no last words for posterity, only a moment of stillness, then a splash. The ocean, ever impartial, made no judgment. It took in the sailor as it took in the storm, the sunken ship, the drifting gull, without fanfare, without forgetting. Even now, standing on a quiet shore or watching a ship on the horizon, one can feel the echo of that old relationship. The sea remembers. Its surface may be calm, but its depths hold stories. Not just of battles or treasure, but of laughter between crewmates, of songs sung to the stars, of fear swallowed and courage found. These are not legends, they are moments, real and vanishing, held together by salt and time. In the end, the ocean was not the enemy of the pirate, it was the witness to all that was noble, foolish, brave and flawed in those who sailed it. And long after their names were lost, long after their flags were lowered, the sea remained, carrying their stories not in books, but in its quiet, ceaseless motion. Far from churches and distant from the cities where priests and pastors held sway, pirates lived in a world of wide skies and endless water, a place where death was always close, and certainty was in short supply.
In that fragile floating space, belief found new forms. Religion aboard a pirate ship was rarely formal, rarely structured, but it was there, tucked into quiet prayers, worn around necks, whispered before storms, and stitched into the quiet fabric of life between horizons. Many pirates, like most seafarers of the early modern world, were raised within Christian traditions. Some were devout, others indifferent, but nearly all carried with them some lingering sense of divine order, or at least of fate. A cross worn on a string, a Bible hidden in a sea chest, a psalm half remembered and muttered before battle. These were not acts of performance, but of private need. For men who faced sudden death almost daily, belief often took the shape of ritual, small habitual gestures that anchored them in something larger than themselves. Ships sometimes carried a Bible, and it was not unusual for pirates to gather for prayer before a dangerous engagement. Some captains allowed or even encouraged such moments, not out of piety, but for morale. There are accounts of pirates reading scripture aloud, often from the Psalms or the Gospels, especially when sickness swept the ship or when land was too far off to feel real. These readings were often brief, unadorned, and unaccompanied by clergy, a simple attempt to touch the sacred amid the chaos. At the same time, many pirates held deep superstitions that mingled with or even replaced formal religion. The sea itself was treated with a kind of reverence, not a god, exactly, but a force that could not be tamed or trusted. Sailors believed the ocean remembered every life taken and every secret buried. Storms were sometimes seen as punishment, and calm seas as blessing. A sudden change in wind might be read as a sign, a warning, or an invitation. Charms and amulets were common. A shark's tooth on a cord, a small pouch of herbs, a coin drilled and worn around the neck. These objects served as protection. Some carried St. Christopher medals, patron saint of travelers. Others clutched wooden beads or carved symbols into their weapons, hoping to borrow strength or favor from powers just out of sight. Superstition wasn't always mystical. Often it was deeply practical. Anything that had once worked, a certain song, a lucky shirt, a particular route taken, might become tradition. And then there were the omens. Whistling aboard ship was frowned upon, believed to summon storms. Killing a seabird, especially an albatross, was thought to bring terrible luck, a belief so strong it endured into literature, famously haunting the mariner in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem centuries later. Even dolphins swimming alongside a ship could stir emotion, seen as guardians or good omens by many. If they vanished suddenly, unease would follow. Some pirates adopted local beliefs as they moved through different regions. Along the West African coast, for example, contact with native religions introduced ideas of ancestor spirits, protective rituals, and sacred symbols. In the Caribbean, African spiritual traditions brought by enslaved people, including early forms of what would later become voodoo, obeah, and santeria, found quiet places aboard ships. Pirates who sailed with freedmen or formerly enslaved crewmates sometimes participated in these rites, not always with full understanding, but with respect born of trust and necessity. These spiritual practices were often communal. Offerings were made, songs sung, and rhythms drummed on the deck after dark. Smoke from herbs or candles might drift across the planks while the stars moved overhead. There are even scattered records of shipboard ceremonies meant to bless a new voyage or protect against bad luck. They were small, improvised but meaningful. A sip of rum poured into the sea, a prayer scratched into the mast, a name spoken to the wind. Pirate burials, too, often blended belief with necessity. When a crewmate died, whether from illness, injury, or punishment, there was rarely time or space for elaborate rites.
The body would be sewn into sailcloth, often with a weight like a cannonball at the feet, and slid into the sea. But before that moment, there might be a verse, a moment of silence, or even a final toast. Some pirates crossed themselves, others simply touched the deck, closed their eyes, and listened to the water. Faith also entered pirate life through its absences. Many pirates had rejected not only the laws of land, but also the churches that justified them. Some saw clergy as hypocrites, aligned with wealth and power. Yet even these men, when faced with the quiet terror of the open ocean, sometimes turned back toward the divine, not in submission, but in curiosity. What lies beyond this water, this life? Who hears me out here where no bell rings and no priest kneels? In these questions the pirate's soul flickered, not always penitent, not always proud, but always human. His faith, like his flag, was his own. It may not have followed the doctrines of crown or cathedral, but it carried weight. A small cross carved into the wooden frame of a bunk, a whispered thanks when land appeared after weeks adrift, a glance skyward when lightning split the horizon. In the end, belief aboard a pirate ship was neither orderly nor absent. It was personal, patchworked, and shaped by wind and tide. It held no dogma, but it held meaning, and in that meaning, a kind of grace. For men who had chosen lives beyond the reach of law, belief offered something quieter, a place to rest their thoughts, to make peace with risk, and to meet the sea not as cowards or conquerors, but as souls adrift in a world that offered no guarantees, only motion and memory.
Before GPS, before satellites or lighthouses, and even before most coastlines were reliably mapped, pirates navigated a world in motion. The maps they carried were not always printed on parchment or held in gilded cases. More often, their guides were half-torn charts, charcoal sketches on sailcloth, etched memories of an inlet's curve, or whispered coordinates shared over a drink in a lamplit tavern. This was not geography as taught in schools, but geography as lived, fluid, uncertain, and passed from hand to hand like a secret. In truth, few pirates had formal training in navigation. Many came from poor or working backgrounds, where schooling was rare and literacy not guaranteed. But the sea offered its own education, and pirates by necessity became masterful observers. They watched for signs, the color of the water over reefs, the movement of clouds, the smell of land long before it was seen. A skilled helmsman could sense wind shifts by the feel of rope in his hands. A seasoned lookout might predict a storm by the stillness of birds or the thickness of air. Tools existed, of course: the compass, the astrolabe, the cross staff, and later the sextant, but their effectiveness varied. Calculating latitude was relatively achievable using the sun's position, but longitude remained elusive until the late 18th century, when marine chronometers revolutionized timekeeping at sea. Until then, distance east or west was guessed based on speed, direction, and the navigator's experience, and guesses could be fatally wrong. Because of this uncertainty, pirates relied heavily on local knowledge. They created informal charts based not just on geography, but on threat and opportunity. A quiet bay where naval ships rarely ventured might be marked with a carved symbol or a coded word. A reef-lined strait, known to trap merchant ships, became a favored hunting ground. Some pirates left signs for each other, carvings on trees, stacked stones, or knots tied in palm leaves, all signaling safety, risk, or hidden stores. The most prized possessions on any ship weren't always gold or guns, but charts, especially those taken from captured vessels. Merchant and naval ships
often carried detailed maps of trade routes, wind patterns, and coastal hazards. When pirates seized a vessel, these maps were often studied first, copied, and sometimes sold. A single chart could open a new corridor for attack or reveal a fresh supply haven. They were the pirates' treasure maps, not to buried gold, but to living opportunity. Still, no map could replace the power of word of mouth. Pirates shared information constantly, especially when docked in known havens. They spoke of new patrol routes, of ports with lenient governors, of a certain captain known to carry Spanish silver or Dutch silks. These fragments formed an ever-evolving picture of the sea, an invisible map, shaped by stories more than shorelines. Taverns and harbors became hubs of this informal intelligence. Sailors from across the Caribbean, the American colonies, Africa, and even Europe traded observations like currency. A man who knew of a hidden cove with fresh water might secure a place on a new crew. Another who had escaped a naval ambush might warn others in time. This was a network without leaders, without permanence, but it was real, and it kept the pirate world turning. This communal memory often transcended language. Pirate crews were notoriously diverse, with members from Africa, Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Some spoke broken English, others Dutch, French, or Portuguese. But necessity bred fluency, in gesture, in tone, in shared ritual. A mark scratched into wood meant the same thing to a Scot, a Spaniard, or a freedman from West Africa. The ocean was the common language, and survival was its grammar. Over time, pirates developed nicknames for certain routes and locations. A narrow channel choked with reefs might be called the Widow's Smile. A shallow bay with a sandy bottom could be the Painter's Rest, for the colors it cast at dusk. These names rarely appeared on maps, but they lingered in memory, passed from one crew to the next, and sometimes lasted longer than any nation's flag planted in the soil. There were also places that disappeared, islands that vanished from charts, ports that changed allegiance, or safe havens that became traps. The sea itself could shift coastlines, silt up inlets, or tear away landmarks in a single storm. Pirates adjusted accordingly. Their maps were never final. They were always sketches in progress, rewritten with every voyage. And still, some chased the unknowable. Myths of hidden islands, lost harbors, or currents that could shave weeks off. A voyage persisted, half folklore, half wishful thinking. Some claimed to know a passage through the Bahamas so narrow and swift that no navy could follow. Others believed in an island that appeared only at night, where fresh fruit grew in abundance and no patrols dared to go. Whether true or not, these tales gave shape to longing, a longing not just for safety or wealth, but for wonder. Today, many of the paths they sailed have changed. Ports have grown, reefs have shifted, and new technologies guide ships with digital precision. But some things remain. Sailors still name places after mood and memory. Currents still carry whispers, and in the quieter corners of maritime lore, the invisible maps remain, drawn not in ink, but in salt and story.
When we imagine a pirate, certain images leap forward. A tricorn hat, a crimson sash, perhaps a gold earring or a tattered coat flapping in the wind. These details, drawn from centuries of paintings, stories, and film, have become symbols. But behind the stylized costume lies a deeper truth. Pirates dressed not just for style or spectacle, but as expressions of identity, function, defiance, and at times longing. Their clothes, like their lives, were pieced together from what they could steal, salvage, or choose for themselves. Unlike naval or merchant crews, who were often issued uniforms or expected to conform to rank-specific dress, pirate crews had no formal dress code. They wore what they pleased,
and what they could find. This meant that pirate clothing was eclectic and adaptive. A man might wear a fine velvet coat taken from a captured officer, patched with coarse canvas where a musket ball had torn the sleeve. Silk waistcoats sat over breeches stained with tar. A broad-brimmed hat might be adorned with a feather, a brass button, or a strip of colored cloth to mark allegiance to no one but the crew. But beyond practicality, dress aboard a pirate ship served as a quiet declaration, "I am no longer yours." Many pirates were former naval or merchant sailors who had lived under rigid rules, forced to wear threadbare uniforms or cast-offs while their officers strode in lace and leather. As pirates, they inverted the hierarchy. The flamboyance often seen in pirate dress, bright colors, rich fabrics, shiny buckles, was not simply vanity, it was reclamation. A stolen coat became not just clothing, but armor against the world that once ranked them beneath notice. The most iconic accessories, too, were rooted in practicality. The tricorn hat, while now emblematic, was a common style of the age. Its three-cornered shape made it easy to toss over the shoulder or hang on a belt when climbing rigging. Bandanas and head wraps protected against the sun and kept sweat from stinging the eyes. Sashes carried pistols, knives, or powder horns. Wide belts secured heavy items and could double as makeshift harnesses in a storm. Footwear varied. Some pirates went barefoot, especially in the tropics where shoes rotted quickly or interfered with grip on slick decks. Others wore tall boots, sometimes mismatched, taken from officers or found among plunder. Jewelry was common among those who could afford it. Gold earrings, often worn with the belief they could pay for a proper burial or passage home. Rings, some believed to ward off bad luck. Beads or carved charms, strung around the neck or wrist as talismans. Tattoos were also widespread, though not always elaborate. A simple anchor, a cross, or a date etched into skin with soot and a sharpened bone could speak volumes. For many pirates, tattoos served not as decoration but as memory, a name, a symbol of escape, a mark of brotherhood. Some pirates tattooed the names of loved ones left behind. Others bore maps, compass roses, or phrases in Latin, Dutch, or English, depending on their past. These marks, often hidden beneath sleeves or shirts, turned the body into a kind of personal logbook. Hair was rarely uniform. Some pirates wore it long, letting it grow wild in the wind. Others tied it back with strips of cloth. Beards were equally varied, some cropped short for comfort, others left unkempt as a mark of disregard for the world's expectations. A few pirates braided their beards or scorched the ends, a practice that contributed to Blackbeard's legendary image. But for most, grooming was pragmatic. Cut it short if lice became a problem, trim it if it caught in rope, leave it if no one cared. Women aboard pirate ships dressed similarly to men, not only out of necessity, but as part of their camouflage in a world that rarely allowed female sailors. Bonny and Mary Red, two of the most famous female pirates, were known to wear trousers, tunics, and weapons openly, blending in with the crew until their identities were revealed, often during moments of crisis. Their clothing was not only disguise, but permission to move freely, to fight, to command respect. It's worth noting that not every pirate dressed flamboyantly. Some were plain, practical, and content in cast-offs. A torn shirt, a simple pair of breeches, and a well-oiled belt might suffice. For them, the sea offered a stripping away of surface. Dress was functional, not symbolic. But even in its simplicity, there was meaning: the refusal to play by anyone else's rules. Artists and writers, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, helped crystallize the pirate aesthetic. Woodcut illustrations from trial pamphlets often exaggerated features for effect, adding eye patches, parrots, or peg legs where none existed. These images became the blueprint for later imaginings: the theatrical pirate of the stage, the romantic rogue of Victorian novels, the costumed adventurer of film. And while these images sometimes veered into fantasy, they were rooted in something real: the pirate's desire to be seen, to stand apart, to wear freedom visibly, even if for a fleeting moment.
In the waning days of the Golden Age, piracy did not vanish overnight. Rather, like the ebb of a high tide from a familiar shore, the rough and audacious spirit that had once held sway over the vast Atlantic gradually receded into quieter currents. The decline was neither violent nor marked by one single defeat. Instead, it was a series of small, persistent changes, shifts in trade routes, improvements in naval technology, and evolving economic and legal frameworks that together slowly squeezed the space in which pirates once thrived. One of the most persistent factors in this slow disappearance was the steady consolidation of state power. As European empires grew more ambitious and organized, with navies built to patrol vast stretches of ocean, the anonymous expanse of the sea was methodically transformed into a controlled, measured domain. Colonial governors and naval officers, once accustomed to turning a blind eye during times of conflict, began to enforce strict regulations more uniformly. Their once fragmented attention coalesced into coordinated missions, complete with improved ships, more systematic intelligence gathering, and better weaponry, leaving pirates fewer margins in which to operate. Simultaneously, commercial trade networks evolved. The merchant routes that had fed pirate ambition became more efficient, more secure, and less predictable to those who had long relied on disrupting them. Advances in navigation, the more widespread use of marine chronometers and more accurate charts, rendered the once favored shallow, twisty passages less exploitable by small, nimble vessels. Even the natural protective measures of local communities began to shift, as ports invested in better defenses and tighter regulations to protect their growing economies. What was once open water now bore the subtle marks of empire, mapped and guarded. Some pirates attempted to adapt by branching out into smuggling, privateering under new orders, or trading in the shadowy back channels of the economy. Those who had once embraced the thrill of rebellion found themselves increasingly confined by the very risk they had once cherished. For many, the lure of brief independence gave way to a desire for stability, a recognition that the unbound freedom of the past carried its own heavy costs. And so, over time, pirate crews began dissolving into smaller fragments. Some settled in remote coastal villages, adopting new names and blending into local cultures. Others found refuge in the growing legal markets of the Americas or the less controlled waters of distant regions. Amid these broader changes, a transformation took place within pirate society itself. The democratic structures that had once defined the life aboard a pirate ship, with its votes on leadership and fair shares of plunder, proved difficult to maintain under constant pressure. As the risks of a life out on the fringe increased, many were left with a stark choice: continue chasing a fleeting ideal of freedom at ever greater peril, or seek the benefits of relative security offered by emerging social structures. For a time, the government-sanctioned privateer emerged as a compromise, a role that allowed for the aggressive reclamation of wealth without the full label of piracy. Yet even that role too was eclipsed by a world that demanded a stable, regulated order. In the gradual decline of piracy, there is also a note of loss and transformation. The boisterous songs and rowdy taverns that had once celebrated the pirate's life gave way to quieter recollections. Folk legends began to idealize an age where daring outlaws ruled the seas, a romanticized memory far removed from the harsh realities of hunger,
disease, and short, brutal careers at sea. As trade grew safer and empires expanded, the space for the pirate story was relegated more and more to books, paintings, and whispered bedtime tales than to the living, breathing world of maritime life. The legacy of the fading pirate era is complex. For some, it represents the triumph of order over chaos, a necessary progression in the evolution of global trade and governance. For others, it stands as a bittersweet reminder of a time when the world was less defined, more audacious, and where even the outlaws carried their own quiet codes of honor. A few remnants of piracy even persisted into modern times in distant corners of the globe, a reminder that no system is ever completely impervious to rebellion. Today, the pirate's flag is raised not on the decks of seafaring vessels, but in our cultural imaginations, a symbol of defiance, adventure, and the enduring human yearning for unbound freedom. The ships of old now rest in museums or lie beneath the ocean's surface, their wood softened by time and salt. Their stories, though tempered by the progress of modernity, still echo against the crashing waves, inviting us to remember that every era has its rebels and every tide eventually must recede.
Long after the last cannon fired and the final sails sank below the horizon, the sea and the land quietly kept the stories pirates left behind. In shallow bays beneath crumbled wharves and scattered along remote coasts, fragments of that life still linger, the silent debris of an age both feared and admired. These are not the treasures of gold and jewels imagined in storybooks, but quieter things: iron nails, rusted tools, musket balls, broken ceramics, human bones, and in their presence a different kind of treasure emerges, not of wealth but of understanding. The field of maritime archaeology, which matured slowly in the 20th century, has become one of the most intimate ways we reconnect with the lives of pirates. Through careful excavation, underwater mapping, and the recovery of artifacts, researchers have pieced together the physical realities of pirate ships, ports, and even daily life. Each discovery brings us closer not to the legend, but to the lived experience, the everyday details that tether myth to memory. One of the most famous sights is the wreck of the Wider Galley, a former slave ship captured by pirate captain Samuel Black Sam Bellamy in 1717. Bellamy transformed the Wider into a heavily armed pirate vessel, but she met her end off the coast of Cape Cod in a brutal storm, taking Bellamy and most of his crew with her. For centuries, the ship was considered lost, until 1984, when explorer Barry Clifford discovered her remains beneath the sand and waves. Since then, hundreds of artifacts have been recovered: cannons, shackles, coins, buttons, and even the ship's bell, engraved with her name. Together, these objects form a quiet, powerful counter-narrative to the fantasy of piracy, a grounded, tangible glimpse into what that life really looked like. Similar discoveries have surfaced in places once known as pirate havens. Port Royal, the infamous Jamaican port that sank during the 1692 earthquake, has yielded entire streets preserved underwater, including shops, homes, and taverns. Archaeologists working among the submerged ruins have found clay pipes, pewter plates, and bottles still sealed with liquid inside. These remnants offer more than spectacle. They remind us that pirates lived not only on ships but in cities, and that their culture left its imprint in architecture, trade goods, and communal spaces. Further out to sea, divers have explored the remains of pirate ships off the coasts of Florida, the Bahamas, and Madagascar. Some wrecks still hold cargo: casks of indigo, copper pots, crates of tools, left behind in a hasty escape or lost to time. Others offer only the outline of a hull, its timbers softened by coral, inhabited now by fish rather than men. These sunken ships,
half erased by salt and sediment, seemed to hover between presence and absence, reminders of lives that moved so fiercely, then vanished so completely. On land, archaeologists have explored known pirate burial grounds, many of them unmarked or half forgotten. Graves found on El Sainte Marie off Madagascar, believed to hold the remains of pirate crews from the Indian Ocean, are simple, often nothing more than stone mounds or wooden markers lost to time. In some cases, personal effects are buried with the bodies: a knife, a ring, a fragment of fabric. These items offer clues not only to identity, but to care. Even among pirates, burial held meaning. Someone took the time to cover the dead, to place a keepsake nearby, to mark a life past. Other pirate remnants exist in the mundane ship, manifests scratched out in cramped handwriting, court transcripts detailing crew testimonies, or forgotten ledgers, noting the sale of seized goods in colonial towns. These scraps of ink and paper, preserved in libraries and archives, are no less archaeological than a shipwreck. They speak of networks, economies, and the long shadow piracy cast across the bureaucratic machinery of empire. And then there are the places where nothing remains, where pirates lived, loved, and died without leaving behind a single artifact. The cove now overgrown with mangroves, the village road paved over where a safe house once stood, the cliffside trail worn smooth by generations, now empty of voices. In these places, archaeology gives way to atmosphere, the sense, however faint, that something passed this way, a breeze that carries the smell of salt and smoke, a certain stillness at dusk, a whisper of a name never written down. As each discovery is made, whether it's a ring encrusted with barnacles or a fragment of a flintlock pistol, the story of piracy becomes less about legend and more about people. These were not mythical figures, but working sailors, rebels, runaways, survivors. Their hands shaped ropes, loaded guns, scrubbed decks, and held one another in fear or laughter. They lived briefly, boldly, and often without ceremony. And yet, the traces of that life remain, carried across centuries by mud, sand, and water. Modern museums now house many of these artifacts, offering visitors a chance to stand face to face with objects touched by pirate hands. A belt buckle once worn in a storm, a coin used to gamble for a night's drink, a piece of wood from a ship that sailed into the unknown. These things speak not of fantasy, but of the deeply human need to make meaning, to leave something behind, however small, in the vast and forgetting sea. Before record players, before musical notation reached far beyond court and church, the sea had its own music, raw, rhythmic, and rooted in the bodies and breath of those who worked upon it. Among pirate crews, where literacy was rare and instruments few, music lived, not in written form, but in memory and motion. It echoed through sails, creaked with timbers, and rose in human voices, part labor, part comfort, part ritual. The sea shanty, a form of work song designed to synchronize group effort, was already well established by the time piracy reached its golden era. Though shanties are most commonly associated with merchant and naval ships of the 18th and 19th centuries, their roots stretch further back, woven into the traditions of sailors from across Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Pirate crews, drawn from these same worlds, brought their own verses aboard, altering, combining, and repurposing them into something uniquely their own. Aboard ship, work songs served both practical and psychological needs. Raising sails, hauling anchor, turning capstans, all demanded coordinated strength. To avoid wasted effort or confusion, sailors sang. A call and response structure allowed one man, often the shantyman, to lead the rhythm, while others joined in on the chorus. The lead might be improvised, teasing, mournful, or bold, depending on mood and need, while the refrain kept the labor steady. Lyrics often told stories. Some were bawdy and filled with innuendo, poking fun at officers, rival ships, or misadventures ashore. Others were nostalgic, recalling lost loves or distant ports. A few were mournful, turning the sea itself into a character, sometimes mother, sometimes monster, always present. These songs changed with each crew and voyage. There was no single version, only shared fragments, shaped like driftwood by time and use. One common theme in pirate songs was freedom, though not always in grand or romantic terms. More often, freedom appeared as a quiet contrast: the open sea versus the rigid land, the deck of a ship versus the chains of a merchant wage. A single verse might compare a captain's lash to the whip of the wind, harsh but without cruelty. In such lines, pirates claimed the right to hardship of their own choosing. Instruments were rare aboard pirate ships, but not unheard of. A fiddle, if someone had the skill to play, might be brought out during calm seas or long anchorings. Drums, sometimes improvised from barrels or crates, added rhythm to dances or celebrations. A pipe, whistle, or simple flute might fill the night air when the stars came out and the wind lay still. But most of the time, it was the human voice that carried music, unaccompanied, weathered, and deeply felt. Nighttime brought a different kind of song. When the day's labor ended and the sea quieted, sailors sometimes sang for themselves. These songs were slower, softer, and more personal. They might be lullabies learned long ago, hymns half remembered, or melodies carried from homelands across oceans. A West African rhythm, a Gaelic lament, a Dutch drinking song. All could drift across the deck in the dark, weaving a soundscape more emotional than any flag or uniform could express. Music also played a role in the rare celebrations pirates allowed themselves. After a successful raid or the division of plunder, the deck might be cleared for dancing. Crude as it may have been, it was joyful, a moment of levity between storms. Rum was passed, songs were shouted more than sung, and for a short while, time itself seemed to loosen its grip. In these moments, music was not performance, but release, a reminder that life, though short, could still be sweet. Songs served memory too. Crews often honored fallen comrades with improvised verses, spoken aloud or sung softly at their burial. These elegies were usually short, unpolished, and intensely personal. They weren't meant for history, but for healing. In a world where graves were rare and goodbyes abrupt, a few lines of melody became the only monument most pirates ever received. Some songs outlived their singers, passed from ship to ship, adapted from one voyage to the next. They formed a kind of oral map, charting places, dangers, and experiences not found in any ledger. A tune might warn of a treacherous reef, a ruthless captain, or a safe port with sympathetic taverners. These were not just songs. They were navigational tools, cultural memory, disguised as melody. In time, many of these pirate songs merged with the broader tradition of sea music. Sailors who once sailed with pirates became legitimate crewmen or moved on to merchant vessels, bringing their songs with them. Others returned to shore life, passing the melodies to children or friends. Over generations, these fragments became part of maritime folklore, and though the names changed, the rhythms endured. Today, sea shanties are sung in folk festivals, recorded by musicians, and echoed in popular media. Their popularity rises and falls like tides, but they remain strangely timeless, their simple structures and heartfelt themes still resonating in a world far removed from sails and salt. When we sing them now, we may not know all the words, but we remember the feeling, a kind of reaching, a kind of holding on, a kind of motion that mirrors the sea itself.
In the great expanse of ocean, where every horizon seemed to stretch farther than the last, companionship was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Aboard a pirate ship, where danger, boredom, and death were constant companions, human connection was often the only anchor. These bonds, formed under pressure and preserved through shared ordeal, created something more than friendship and deeper than mere duty. They became a kind of chosen family, rough-edged, ever-shifting, but fiercely felt. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of naval ships, pirate crews functioned through consensus and cooperation. Each man had a voice, and each relied on the others, not just for survival, but for meaning. These were men, and occasionally women, who had left or lost their families, their homelands, and their pasts. What they built at sea was not a replacement, exactly, but a new structure, a brotherhood without blood, shaped by salt and storm. Friendships blossomed in unexpected ways. The shared labor of the ship, climbing rigging, loading cargo, cooking meals, watching for sails, became a rhythm that pulled people together. A man who helped you patch your hammock, who shared his last swig of rum, or who took your place on night watch when you were sick, might become your closest companion. These relationships, though rarely written about in trial records or official logs, formed the invisible scaffolding of shipboard life. On some ships, these bonds were formalized through matelotage, a practice particularly noted in the Caribbean, where two pirates formed a contractual partnership. They shared goods, loot, and often a bunk. If one died, the other inherited his possessions. Whether matelotage was always romantic or simply practical remains debated by historians, but the emotional weight it carried is clear. At sea, where the future was always uncertain, to trust someone so deeply was both rare and profound. Romantic relationships between pirates may have existed quietly, shielded by the intimacy and isolation of life aboard ship. The lack of surviving records, due to stigma, censorship, and the secrecy such bonds required, leaves much unknown. Still, whispers of deep affection, of partners who fought side by side, or grieved with fierce devotion, linger in the oral traditions and fragments that remain. Love, in any form, has always found its way through silence. Even in non-romantic terms, loyalty among crewmates ran deep. Pirates risked their lives for each other during battles, storms, and mutinies. A crewmate wounded in a raid might be carried back aboard by his fellows, tended to with the ship's limited supplies, and honored if he died. Some pirates even sought vengeance for fallen friends, attacking the ships or ports responsible. These acts were not just tactical, they were personal. Stories from trial accounts sometimes hint at these emotional bonds. A dying pirate asking for a message to be sent to a friend. A crewmate testifying on behalf of another, risking his own life to speak the truth. A man who, when captured, confessed only to protect those he had sailed with. These flickering moments, scattered in official documents, suggest a world of feeling that existed beneath the surface, steady, unrecorded, and quietly powerful. Of course, conflict existed too. Pirate crews were filled with strong personalities and short tempers. Arguments could erupt over loot, leadership, or slights, real and imagined. Some ships operated on hair-trigger codes of honor, and duels, whether with pistols or cutlasses, occasionally erupted. But even conflict was handled communally. The crew often acted as jury, deciding guilt, mediating disputes, and choosing whether to exile, punish, or forgive. Justice, imperfect though it was, came not from law but from the will of those who shared the deck. There was also laughter, rough,
often crude but healing. Pirates joked, teased, played cards, and sang not just to pass the time, but to stay human in a world that asked much and promised little. A crew might share stories from childhood, boast about fictional conquests, or invent tall tales of sea monsters and hidden treasure just to entertain one another through a windless stretch. These moments, though fleeting, stitched warmth into otherwise cold days. On rare occasions, pirate crews even included children or teenagers, either born into the life or swept up through capture and adoption. These younger members were often protected by older crewmates, trained in the skills of sailing, fed from the communal pot, and kept from the most dangerous work until they proved ready. In these relationships, the tenderness of parental instinct emerged, quiet and unexpected, amidst the rough life of the sea. Pets too played a part. Parrots, cats, and monkeys sometimes traveled with pirate crews, not as exotic trophies, but as companions. A bird that mimicked a captain's laugh, a cat that kept rats away from food stores, a monkey that climbed the rigging during calm days. Each added character and comfort to the ship's floating world. These animals too became part of the family. When a pirate died, whether in battle, storm, or illness, his absence was felt deeply. There might be no funeral in the traditional sense, but the crew would mark the moment. A few words spoken into the wind, a toast poured into the sea, a song sung more quietly that night, and later perhaps a story told. He was the one who saved me in the harbor at Nassau, or he always made us laugh when the sails were slack. In memory as in life, these bonds endured.
To understand piracy fully, one must look not just at the ships and the seas, but at the great scaffolding of the world they sailed through. The pirate era was born not in isolation, but in the long shadow of empire, a vast, restless expansion of European powers into the Americas, Africa, and Asia. These empires carved the globe into lines and ports, traded goods across oceans, and wove new economies built on extraction and control. In the spaces between their reach, piracy grew, not just as resistance, but as reaction. By the late 1600s, Europe's great colonial powers, Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and Portugal, were locked in near constant rivalry. Their merchants sailed deep routes across the Atlantic, ferrying sugar, silver, tobacco, spices, and slaves. Fortunes were made on the backs of this trade, and those fortunes relied on fragile networks of ships, maps, and often violence. Pirates inserted themselves into these systems not as wild anomalies, but as deeply connected participants, disrupting, benefiting, and at times even reinforcing the flows of empire. The triangular trade, linking Europe, West Africa, and the Americas, became the spine of Atlantic commerce. European goods were traded for enslaved people along the African coast, who were then forced across the ocean in brutal voyages to the Caribbean and American colonies. From there, raw materials were shipped back to European markets. Pirates raided these routes, capturing slave ships, stealing cargo, and sometimes freeing or enslaving the people on board themselves. Their actions were not always moral, but they revealed the vulnerability and cruelty of the systems they plundered. Pirates were also products of these same systems. Many had served on navy or merchant ships involved in colonial expansion. Others had been born into poverty in Europe's crowded cities, where the promise of seafaring offered either escape or conscription. Some were indigenous people displaced by conquest, or Africans who had escaped enslavement. The pirate crew, for all its lawlessness, reflected the global mix of cultures, conflicts, and coercions that empire had created. Ports became pressure points. The Caribbean, with its wealth of islands and its strategic position between the old and new worlds, was both jewel
and weakness. Colonial governors, dependent on trade and military support from distant capitals, found themselves navigating a delicate balance, enforcing laws without alienating local economies that often depended, unofficially, on piracy. At times, pirate crews were even welcomed, their stolen goods sold at discount to eager buyers who asked few questions. In some cases, pirates became pawns in imperial rivalries. During wartime, they were issued letters of marque, transforming them into legal privateers tasked with attacking enemy vessels. But when peace returned, those same captains were often cast out, their skills suddenly criminal again. This inconsistency reflected a deeper truth. Empires used pirates when convenient and discarded them when power no longer required their services. Pirates, for their part, navigated these shifting allegiances with wary pragmatism. The global spread of piracy also reached far beyond the Atlantic. In the Indian Ocean, pirates such as Henry Every and Thomas Tew targeted Mughal ships and East India Company vessels, drawing furious diplomatic protest from Asian rulers. In response, European powers were forced to confront the global reach of their own outlaws, not just as nuisances, but as liabilities in the delicate dance of empire and trade. In this way, piracy was not a footnote to history, but a mirror, reflecting the instability, ambition, and contradiction of the age. Pirates exploited the gaps in empire, the remote islands, the underpaid sailors, the corrupt officials. But they also revealed something deeper. They showed how thin the line between order and disorder could be. A governor could profit from a pirate one year and hang him the next. A sailor could become a privateer, then a pirate, then a smuggler, all without ever leaving the same waters. And yet, even as empires cracked down and trade routes evolved, piracy lingered. Its persistence testified to more than greed. It hinted at discontent with hierarchy, with injustice, with the cold machinery of empire that demanded loyalty but gave little in return. A pirate ship, for all its flaws, offered something rare: autonomy. A chance, however fleeting, to choose one's path outside the rigid scaffolding of law and empire. By placing piracy within its global context, we begin to see it not as chaos, but as commentary, a scattered but sharp response to the forces that shaped the early modern world. These weren't rebels against nothing. They were entangled with everything: sugar and slavery, war and diplomacy, language and law. Their presence disrupted trade, challenged legal norms, and forced empires to rethink how they controlled the sea. Today, we often remember pirates as isolated figures, flags waving above wild decks, but they were part of a much larger story, inseparable from the rise of capitalism, the spread of empire, and the violent rearrangement of the world that defined the age. They lived in the margins of maps, yes, but those margins moved, and so did they, sailing always just ahead of the reach of order. Long after the last black flag was lowered, and the final broadside echoed into silence, the figure of the pirate remained, not in fleets or forts, but in the folds of imagination. The pirate, once hunted and hanged, took on new life in ballads, paintings, novels, and songs. With each retelling, the figure blurred further from fact into myth, transformed from outlaw to archetype, from feared sailor to folk hero. And yet, behind the embellishments, something human remained, a glimmer of the choices, longings, and courage that first sent these men and women out upon uncertain tides. The transformation of pirate memory began early. Even as courts condemned them, printers and playwrights turned them into characters. Trial pamphlets, sold cheaply across Europe, dramatized their last words and embellished their crimes. These tales, meant to frighten and moralize, often had the opposite effect.
Audiences were drawn to the drama, the danger, the sense of a life lived on the edge. Over time, the scaffold became a stage, and the pirate a performer, both villain and victim in the eyes of the crowd. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Romanticism had taken hold. As empires grew more secure and distant, and as the realities of colonial conquest became less visible to those back home, piracy began to seem less like a threat and more like a lost adventure. Poets and novelists reimagined pirates, not as thieves, but as rebels, tragic figures pushed too far, or seekers of something purer than civilization offered. Treasure Island, Captain Singleton, and Peter Pan painted pirates as clever, cunning, and full of life. Even their cruelty, when shown, was often softened by humor or bravado. Theaters followed, with plays that filled candlelit halls with sword fights, hidden maps, and longing gazes across imaginary waves. Children began to dress as pirates, not soldiers. Costumes replaced uniforms. Fantasy overtook fact. And so the image of the pirate evolved. The gritty, sunburnt sailor became the swaggering rogue. The deck-bound laborer became the one-legged captain with a glint in his eye. The desperate outlaw became the charming rogue with a treasure to find and a toast to raise. Somewhere between history and hope, a new pirate was born, one we still recognize today. In the 20th century, cinema carried this image further. Black and white adventures gave way to Technicolor extravaganzas, and then to sprawling film franchises filled with spectacle and sound. Each generation found its own pirate archetype, daring, witty, slightly dangerous, but always larger than life. These portrayals, while far from historical, reflected a deep cultural yearning, the wish to step outside the rules, to live fully in motion, to feel the salt wind, and choose one's own course. Outside the screen, pirate memory has taken on its own rituals. Coastal towns around the world now host pirate festivals, where locals and tourists don trekkern hats, hoist flags, and speak in imagined accents. Tall ships sail into harbors, cannons fire blanks, parades wind through streets where real pirates once hid from view. These festivals are not history lessons, but memory and celebration, a way of honoring the wildness of the past without its pain. Museums and historical societies, meanwhile, have worked to anchor the myth in reality. Exhibits display the weapons, coins, clothing, and ships recovered from real wrecks. They tell the quieter stories of the young deckhand lost in a storm, of the African sailor who rose to command, of the woman who carved her name into a world that tried to deny her place. These stories complicate the myth, enriching it without destroying it. In literature, pirates remain symbols of ambiguity. They stand for freedom and theft, for courage and cruelty, for loneliness and loyalty. Writers return to them not just for action, but for reflection. What does it mean to reject the world you're born into? What price is paid for choosing your own name, your own ship, your own fate? And so, in classrooms, on bookshelves, and in late-night conversations, pirates continue to live. Children still dream of buried treasure. Artists still sketch ships lost in fog. Musicians still sing of sails and sirens, of rum and rebellion. The pirate, like the sea itself, shifts shape, sometimes calm, sometimes fierce, always full of mystery. Yet beneath all these layers of fantasy, something remains that is quiet and real. The pirate as person. The sailor who left behind a narrow life to chase something wide and uncertain. The outcast who built bonds with strangers, carved new laws on old wood, and watched the horizon not for empire, but for opportunity. These memories, soft but enduring, echo not only in stories, but in us. For the pirate, ultimately, is not just a figure of history, but a question we still ask. What would we choose
if the winds were fair and the rules no longer held. And in that question, the pirate lives on, not in gold or glory, but in the dream of motion, of freedom, of something wild and beautiful just beyond the edge of the map.
And so the sails are lowered, the wind fades, the ship rocks gently, anchored in calm waters at last. After many hours spent tracing the hidden lives and overlooked truths of pirates, we arrive not at an ending but at something more like stillness. The quiet that comes when a long journey has run its course, and the sea no longer asks for movement. What began as a life of resistance, a challenge to kings, to captains, to the grinding gears of empire, has become, in memory, a mosaic of human experience. We have seen that piracy was not only battle and bounty, but rhythm and ritual, longing and laughter. That beneath the black flags and tales of plunder lived people who ate, sang, wept and waited. People who stitched sails by moonlight, who carved names into deck beams, who told jokes to chase off fear and looked to the stars not just to navigate, but to remember something bigger than themselves. Their world was dangerous. Yes, brief, often violent, but it was also woven with hope. Hope that one could live by choice rather than command, that one might build a ship not only to escape, but to belong, that far from the courts and crowns there might be space, even just a sliver, to breathe freely, to speak one's mind, and to die on one's own terms. The pirate's legacy, then, is not only in the cannon fire or hidden gold, but in that idea that people, when pressed to the edge, will always seek new shapes for freedom, sometimes messily, sometimes selfishly, sometimes with deep generosity. Aboard a pirate ship, where class and creed blended into survival, the sea became not just a backdrop, but a crucible, testing who could lead, who could be trusted, and what a fair share might mean when the next storm could take everything. We have traced the rise and fall of their world, from the wild harbors of Nassau to the echoing halls of Admiralty courts, from the tangled rigging of sloops and brigs to the silent graves on distant shores. We've heard their songs, felt their storms, witnessed their trials and toasts, their buried stories and sudden ends. We've seen how they were feared, then romanticized, then quietly remembered by those who kept their memory alive, not in headlines, but in whispered tales, passed down like salt on the tongue. In the quiet that follows now, there is a softness to what remains. The image of a tattered flag fluttering at dusk, a rope swinging gently in the breeze, the pale glow of lantern light against wood worn smooth by time. Somewhere, a parrot calls out from an unseen perch. Somewhere, a ghost ship drifts through fog, crewed not by spirits, but by memory itself. These stories, and the people within them, are not gone. They linger in the shape of coastlines, in the broken hulls beneath the sea, in the songs that drift into children's dreams. They remind us that history is not only written in stone, but whispered in tide and wind, in the names we still recall, and the ones we no longer know but feel just the same. And so we let them rest, not with finality, but with reverence. The pirates, once scattered across oceans and centuries, gather here, not as villains or saints, but as human beings who lived for a moment on the edge of the world and made that edge their own. As we step away from the deck, the sea stretches out behind us, eternal, unchanging, and full of stories still untold. The horizon softens into mist. The wind has grown quiet, but somewhere, in the mind's last waking thought, a sail still catches light.